They say an alpha never kneels. But when your own blood turns the blade, when the throne you built with broken bones becomes your cage, when the woman you claimed as salvation spits in your face and calls you monster, you learn that power is just another word for loneliness. I was Riker Vance, king, conqueror, fool. This is the story of how I lost everything trying to own the one thing that refused to be owned. Stay with me until the end. You'll see how empires crumble not from outside enemies, but from the rot we nurture inside our own chests. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to know where my tribe is watching from. The rain came down like nails on iron the night everything changed. Riker Vance stood at the northern wall of his compound, watching lightning crack the sky over the Black Ridge Mountains. Water ran down the scarred plains of his face, mixing with something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the first tremor of doubt he'd felt in 15 years. Behind him, the great hall blazed with torchlight and voices raised in celebration. Another victory. Another territory absorbed into his empire. The other alphas had learned to either bend the knee or disappear into unmarked graves. That was how it worked in this world. You dominated or you died. Riker's second-in-command, Garrett Kane, appeared at his shoulder. The man moved like smoke, quiet for someone built like a battering ram. "You should be inside," Garrett said. "Council's asking questions." "Let them ask. They want to know why we're holding that girl in the East Tower." Riker's jaw tightened. "Her name is Alara." Garrett spat into the mud. "Don't matter what her name is. Matters that she's causing problems you don't need. Half the council thinks you've gone soft. The other half thinks you've lost your damn mind." Riker turned to face him fully. The Alpha King stood 6'4" with shoulders that looked carved from the mountains themselves. Scars tracked across his knuckles, his forearms, the left side of his neck, where an opponent's blade had kissed too close. His eyes were the color of winter steel, and right now they held the kind of cold that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "What do you think, Garrett?" Garrett held his gaze for 3 seconds, which was longer than most could manage. "I think you're playing with fire that burns different than what you're used to. I think obsession looks a lot like weakness to the wolves circling this kingdom." "Then let them circle." Riker walked past him, boots splashing through puddles that reflected fractured lightning. He moved through the compound like he owned every stone of it, because he did. Men stepped aside. Women lowered their eyes. Children watched from doorways with that mixture of awe and fear that he'd grown accustomed to like a second skin. The East Tower stood apart from the main structures, connected by a covered walkway that Riker had ordered built 3 weeks prior. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his heartbeat doing something irregular that he refused to name. 2 guards flanked the heavy oak door. They straightened when they saw him, fists to chests in salute. "Leave," Riker said. They obeyed without question. That was the benefit of absolute authority. You didn't have to explain yourself. He pushed open the door. Alara Quinn sat by the window, backlit by stormlight. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't acknowledge him at all. Her dark hair fell loose past her shoulders, and she wore the plain gray dress he'd provided because she'd torn the fancy ones to shreds the first week. "You should eat," Riker said, nodding toward the untouched tray of food near the door. "You should go to hell." Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. That was the thing about Alara that had hooked him from the start. She didn't need volume to make an impact. Every word she spoke felt like a judgment, a challenge, a refusal to pretend he was anything other than what he was. Riker moved closer, his footsteps deliberate on the stone floor. "I've given you every comfort, safety, protection. More freedom than any prisoner in this compound has ever had." Now she turned, and her eyes blazed with something that made his chest constrict. "Freedom? You call this freedom?" "I'm locked in a tower, Riker. Guards at my door. You've cut me off from everyone I knew. This isn't protection. This is ownership. Everything I have, I own. That's how this world works. Not me." She stood, and even though she barely reached his shoulder, she somehow occupied more space than he did. "You don't own me. You never will. And every day you keep me here, you become less of a king and more of a tyrant clinging to something he knows he doesn't deserve." The words hit like physical blows. Riker felt his hands curl into fists, felt the familiar surge of anger that had solved most of his problems throughout his violent life. But with Alara, anger just crashed against her defiance and broke apart like waves on stone. Why do you fight this? He asked, and hated how the question sounded. Like weakness. Like want. I've seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. You feel it too. This pull between us. Alara laughed, and it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. What I feel is pity. You're so powerful that you've forgotten what it means to earn something instead of taking it. You've surrounded yourself with people who say yes to everything, and now you've mistaken my defiance for desire. She moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. I don't want you, Riker. I want my life back. I want to walk out that door and never see your face again. Silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. That's not going to happen, Riker said finally. Then you've already lost. He wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he'd pulled her from a raided village that would have been destroyed anyway, that keeping her here had likely saved her life, that what he felt wasn't obsession but something deeper and more necessary than breath. But the words died in his throat because somewhere beneath the armor of his certainty, a small voice whispered that she was right. Riker left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to make the frame shudder. He stood in the hallway, chest heaving, hands trembling with an emotion he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge. Garrett was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Well? Riker brushed past him. Call the council. We meet at dawn. What are you going to tell them? That Alara Quinn stays. That anyone who questions it can challenge me in the circle. Garrett grabbed his arm, which was a bold move that spoke to how long they'd known each other. Brother, listen to me. You're about to burn every alliance you've built over a woman who spits in your face. Is she really worth that? Riker yanked his arm free. His voice came out low and dangerous. Yes. The council chamber was carved into the mountain itself, a circular room with a dome ceiling that amplified every word spoken within it. Dawn light filtered through narrow windows as Riker entered, and the 12 council members rose from their stone seats in unison. These were the pillars of his empire, warriors who'd fought beside him, strategists who'd planned his conquests, administrators who kept the territories running smooth. Each one commanded respect and loyalty from their own factions. Together, they were the backbone of everything he'd built. Riker took his seat at the head of the table, a throne of black iron and wolf pelts. Garrett stood at his right hand. The air tasted like tension and smoke from the braziers burning in each corner. Councilman Voss spoke first. He was old guard, grizzled and scarred from 100 battles. We have reports from the Eastern Territories. Unrest is growing. They're questioning whether the Alpha King's attention is where it should be. My attention is exactly where it needs to be, Riker said. Councilwoman Mira leaned forward. With all due respect, holding that girl hostage while ignoring diplomatic channels is creating problems we don't need. The Southern Alliance is making noise about our stability. She's not a hostage. She's under my protection. Protection from what? Voss demanded. She was nobody. A villager from a settlement we absorbed. Why does she matter more than the Empire's stability? Riker's hands gripped the armrests of his throne hard enough to make the iron creak. Because I say she matters. The room erupted. Council members spoke over each other, voices rising in challenge and concern. This was unprecedented. Riker had always ruled with iron logic, making decisions based on strategy and strength. Emotion had no place in leadership. That was the first lesson he'd learned as a young alpha clawing his way to power. Garrett raised his hand for silence, and slowly the room settled. Garrett's voice carried the weight of someone who'd saved Riker's life more times than either of them could count. I've known Riker Vance since we were boys fighting for scraps in the slums of Greywater. I've seen him take wounds that should have killed him and walk away without flinching. I've watched him build this empire from nothing but will and violence. So when I say this, understand it comes from a place of loyalty. He paused, his gaze heavy on Riker. This obsession with Alara Quinn is going to destroy everything we've built if you don't let her go. Riker stood slowly. The movement was predatory, controlled. Every eye in the room tracked him as he descended the steps from his throne and walked to the center of the circle. You think I don't know what this looks like? You think I don't feel the Empire shifting beneath my feet? He turned, meeting each council member's gaze in turn. I've given everything to this kingdom. My blood, my youth. Every scar on my body was earned keeping you safe, keeping the borders secure, keeping the wolves at bay. And now you sit here and question me over one woman? It's not about the woman, Mira said quietly. It's about what she represents. A crack in the armor. A weakness enemies can exploit. She's not a weakness. Riker's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more frightening. She's the only real thing in a world built on lies and violence. Every one of you has pretended to serve me out of loyalty when really it's just fear and self-interest. Alara doesn't pretend. She sees exactly what I am and refuses to bow anyway. That's not weakness. That's strength I don't have anywhere else in this compound. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Voss stood, his hand dropping to the blade at his belt. If you're too blind to see what you're becoming, then maybe it's time for new leadership. Riker smiled, and it was the expression of a wolf scenting blood. You challenging me, old man? I'm doing what needs to be done. The fight was brutal and short. Voss was skilled, but he was past his prime and Riker was in his. They met in the center of the circle with the crash of bodies and the ring of steel. Blood spattered on ancient stone. Riker moved like violence incarnate, every strike calculated to wound, to dominate, to remind everyone watching what happened when you questioned the Alpha King. It ended with Voss on his knees, Riker's blade at his throat, both men breathing hard. Yield, Riker said. Voss spat blood. I yield. Riker pulled the blade away but didn't sheath it. He looked around the circle, meeting every eye. Anyone else? No one moved. No one spoke. Good. Alara stays. This council serves at my pleasure. Anyone who has a problem with that knows where the door is. He walked out, leaving Voss bleeding on the floor and the council in stunned silence. Outside, his hand shook. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from the realization that Alara was right. He was becoming something he'd sworn he'd never be. The tyrants he'd overthrown to build this empire had started exactly like this, prioritizing their own wants over their people's needs. But he couldn't stop. The thought of letting her go created a void in his chest that felt like death itself. 3 days later, reports came from the northern border. A faction led by General Marcus Thorne, one of Riker's most trusted field commanders, had declared independence. They'd seized 2 settlements and were fortifying positions. Garrett delivered the news personally, spreading maps across the war table in Riker's private chambers. Marcus is calling it a necessary correction. Says the Alpha King has lost his way and real leadership is needed. How many men does he have? 2,000, maybe 3. Veterans mostly. They know how we fight. Riker studied the maps, mind racing through tactics and strategies. But part of him, a growing part, couldn't focus. Because Alara was 3 floors above him, alone in that tower, and the distance felt unbearable. We mobilize at dawn, he said. Full force. We crush this rebellion before it spreads. Garrett didn't move. You know what Marcus is doing, right? He's forcing you to choose. Lead your army like an Alpha King should, or stay here obsessing over a woman who hates you. Either way, you lose. Riker's fist slammed onto the table hard enough to crack the wood. I don't lose. But his voice lacked conviction, and they both heard it. That night, Riker went to Alara's tower. She was awake, sitting in the window seat, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. There's a rebellion, he said without preamble. One of my generals has turned against me. Good. The word was simple, final. It hit harder than any blade. Riker crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing her shoulders. Do you understand what happens if I fall? This empire fractures into warring factions. Thousands die. The stability we've built collapses into chaos. Alara looked up at him with those dark eyes that saw too much. And whose fault is that? You built an empire on fear instead of loyalty. You demanded submission instead of earning respect. Now it's falling apart because the man at the top cares more about possessing one woman than protecting his people. She reached up, touching his face with surprising gentleness. You could have been great, Riker, a real king. Instead, you chose to be a collector of things you can't keep. He wanted to argue, wanted to shake her until she understood that everything he'd done was to create a world where she could be safe. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere in the broken places of his soul, he knew she was speaking truth. Come with me, he said suddenly, to battle. Stand beside me. She pulled away. I'm not a trophy you parade around to prove your worth. Then what do you want from me? Alara stood, and for the first time he saw tears in her eyes. I want you to let me go. I want you to be the man you pretend to be instead of the monster you're becoming. I want you to save your empire instead of destroying it over someone who will never love you back." The silence stretched between them like an open wound. "I can't," Riker whispered. "Then we're both prisoners here." He left before dawn, leading 5,000 warriors north toward Marcus Thorne's rebellion. But he stationed 50 guards around Alara's tower with orders that no one enters or leaves. If he couldn't have her cooperation, he'd settle for her safety. The march took 3 days. 3 days of Riker's mind splitting between military strategy and the memory of Alara's face when she called him monster. 3 days of his commanders exchanging worried glances, of soldiers whispering about the Alpha King's distraction. They met Marcus Thorne's forces in a valley called Razor's Edge, a fitting name for what was about to happen. Both armies lined up across from each other, banners snapping in wind that tasted like snow and violence. Marcus rode out alone, sitting tall on a gray warhorse. He was younger than Riker by 5 years, built like a sledgehammer, with the kind of charisma that made men follow him into hell. Riker met him in the neutral ground between armies. "This is your last chance," Riker said. "Bend the knee, and I'll be merciful." Marcus laughed. "Merciful? Like you've been merciful to that girl you're holding prisoner? Like you've been merciful to anyone who questions your obsession?" He shook his head. "You taught me that weakness gets you killed, Riker. And you're weak now, compromised. This kingdom deserves better." "And you think you're better?" "I think I remember what it means to put the Empire first. They didn't fight that day." Both armies withdrew as night fell, and Riker sat in his command tent staring at maps that meant nothing. Because Garrett was right, and Marcus was right, and Alara was right. He was losing everything trying to hold on to the one thing that refused to be held. A messenger arrived at midnight, mud-splattered and exhausted. He carried a sealed letter with Riker's personal mark. Garrett opened it, read it, and his face went pale. "What?" Riker demanded. "It's the compound. There's been an attack. The East Tower. Alara's guards were killed. She's been taken." The world tilted. Riker grabbed the letter, reading words that turned his blood to ice. A coordinated strike, professional. The attackers had left a message carved into the tower door. "She was never yours." "Who?" Riker's voice came out strangled. Garrett met his eyes. "The signature suggests someone inside our own council." This wasn't Marcus. This was closer to home. Riker stood, and the rage that flooded through him was unlike anything he'd felt before. It wasn't the clean anger of battle or the righteous fury of defending his territory. This was something darker, more primal, something that promised blood and ashes and the complete annihilation of whoever had dared touch what was his. "Prepare the men," he said quietly. "We march back." "Now." "What about Marcus?" "Marcus can wait. Whoever took her is about to learn what happens when you cross the Alpha King." But as they broke camp in the pre-dawn darkness, as 5,000 warriors turned around to chase a ghost, Riker felt the first real stirrings of fear, not for himself, but for what he might do when he found the people responsible. Not for his empire, but for the man he was becoming in pursuit of a woman who had begged him to let her go. The rain started again as they rode south, and Riker pushed his horse harder than he should have, leaving his army struggling to keep pace. Because somewhere in the night, Alara was in danger, and he would burn the entire world down to get her back, even if it meant becoming the monster she'd named him, even if it meant losing everything else in the process. The gates of his compound came into view as dawn broke bloody and red across the horizon, and Riker knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The compound gates hung open like a broken jaw, and that was the first sign that everything had gone to hell. Riker pulled his horse to a violent stop, the animal's hooves throwing mud and gravel. Behind him, Garrett and the vanguard thundered closer, but Riker was already dismounting, already moving toward the carnage with a singular focus that blocked out everything else. Bodies littered the courtyard. His guards, men he'd trained personally, they lay twisted in positions that spoke of ambush and overwhelming force. The rain had washed most of the blood away, but the smell remained, mixing with smoke from buildings that had been set ablaze and hastily extinguished. Riker's boots splashed through puddles turned pink. His mind cataloged details with the detached efficiency of a man who'd walked through massacre before. Throat cuts. Professional work. No struggle meant they'd been taken by surprise, which meant someone inside had opened the gates. Someone trusted. The East Tower stood intact but desecrated. The heavy oak door hung off its hinges. Riker took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that felt like panic, though he refused to name it that. Alphas didn't panic. Alphas controlled. Alphas dominated. But the room at the top was empty. Alara's blanket lay crumpled on the floor. The window seat where she'd spent hours staring at mountains she couldn't reach still held the indent of her body. The untouched dinner tray had been knocked over, food scattered across stone, and carved into the wooden frame of the door, deep enough to splinter the grain, were the words, "She was never yours." Riker stood in the center of that empty room and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, because he'd stopped believing he had one of those years ago, but something fundamental, some load-bearing pillar of his identity that had kept him upright through wars and betrayals and the grinding weight of absolute power. Garrett appeared in the doorway, breathing hard from the climb. His face was grim. 50 guards dead. The attack came from inside and outside simultaneously. Someone disabled the alarm bells. Someone knew our patrol rotations down to the minute. Who? Garrett hesitated, and that hesitation told Riker everything he needed to know. We found Councilwoman Mira in her chambers, throat slit. Same with Voss. Voss was already disloyal. Mira was the voice calling for Alara's release. Why kill them? Because they were the obvious suspects. Garrett moved into the room, his boots crunching on scattered pottery. Whoever orchestrated this wanted to eliminate the council members most likely to oppose them while framing it as internal conflict. They're cleaning house and removing you in one move. Where's the rest of the council? Locked in the Great Hall under guard. I didn't know who to trust. Smart. Riker forced himself to breathe, to think like a strategist instead of a man whose world was disintegrating. Marcus Thorne's rebellion wasn't the real threat. This was. Someone close enough to know his weaknesses, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment, ruthless enough to kill their own people to cover tracks. He descended the tower stairs with Garrett at his side. The compound was chaos. Warriors who'd stayed behind milled around, waiting for orders. Civilians huddled in doorways. The whole place stank of fear and uncertainty, and Riker knew that smell was blood in the water for anyone looking to challenge his authority. Here's what you need to understand about power and obsession. They feed each other in a loop that tightens until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Riker had spent 15 years building an empire on the principle that strength was the only currency that mattered. He'd crushed rivals, absorbed territories, bent thousands to his will through sheer force of dominance. And it had worked because he'd been pure in his ruthlessness, uncomplicated by anything resembling human attachment. Then Alara Quinn walked into his world with her quiet defiance and her eyes that saw straight through every wall he'd built, and suddenly the foundation he'd constructed his entire identity on started to crack. Because wanting her wasn't about power. It was about need, and need was weakness, and weakness was death. But he couldn't stop. That was the trap. Every moment he spent trying to keep her close, he became less of the Alpha King his empire required and more of a man desperate for something he couldn't take by force. And the wolves circling his kingdom could smell that desperation like rot. The Great Hall was exactly as imposing as Riker had designed it to be. Vaulted ceilings, walls lined with weapons from conquered enemies. The massive throne of black iron and wolf pelts that had witnessed 1,000 judgments and 0 mercy. The remaining council members sat at the stone table under the watchful eyes of 20 guards Garrett had personally selected. Riker entered and every head turned. He didn't sit, didn't speak immediately, just let the silence stretch until it became suffocating, until the weight of his presence reminded everyone exactly who held power here. Councilman Drake spoke first. He was middle-aged, shrewd, with the kind of calculating intelligence that made him dangerous in politics if not in combat. We heard about the attack, about Alara Quinn's abduction. This is a catastrophe. It's a declaration of war. Riker's voice was quiet, but it carried. Someone in this compound orchestrated the kidnapping of a person under my direct protection. They murdered 50 of my guards. They killed 2 council members to muddy the waters, and they did it while I was dealing with Marcus Thorne's rebellion. He let his gaze sweep across each face. That level of coordination means inside information, deep inside. Drake leaned forward. With respect, this proves what many of us have been saying. Your obsession with that woman has made you vulnerable. It's created fractures that enemies are exploiting. Be very careful with your next words, Riker said softly. I'm trying to save your kingdom. Drake stood, placing both palms on the table. Let her go. Publicly announce that Alara Quinn is no longer your concern. Show the Empire that you're putting stability first. It's the only way to stop this bleeding. Riker moved then, circling the table like a predator. You think I should abandon her, prove my strength by sacrificing the one person I've claimed as mine? Yes. If that's what it takes to preserve what we've built. And what do you think that teaches our enemies? That the Alpha King abandons his people when they become inconvenient? That loyalty means nothing when politics get complicated? She's not your people. She's one woman who despises you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Riker stopped directly behind Drake's chair, close enough that the older man had to fight not to flinch. Garrett, call in the interrogators. We're going to have a very thorough conversation with every person who had access to the compound's security protocols. You can't seriously suspect the Council, Drake protested. I suspect everyone. Riker returned to his throne, settling into it with the weight of absolute authority. You're right about one thing. My attention on Alara created an opening, but that opening revealed something more important. It showed me who sees this empire as something worth protecting versus who sees it as something worth stealing. He leaned forward. So here's what's going to happen. We find Alara. We find who took her. And then I'm going to demonstrate exactly what happens when you mistake my capacity for mercy as an invitation for betrayal. The interrogations lasted 18 hours. Riker presided over each one personally, watching faces, listening for the catch in voices that indicated deception. His interrogators were specialists in extracting truth through methods that ranged from psychological pressure to outright torture, and Riker felt no guilt about unleashing them. These were the tools of Empire. This was what kept order. But every scream from the lower chambers, every broken confession of minor infractions and petty disloyalties, none of it brought him closer to Alara. None of it identified the architect of this coup. By dawn of the second day, Riker stood alone in his private chambers, staring at maps that showed his empire fragmenting in real time. Marcus Thorne had seized 3 more settlements while Riker was distracted. Reports from the Western Territories spoke of bandits growing bold, testing borders that had been secure for years. The Southern Alliance was making diplomatic overtures that sounded friendly but carried the subtle threat of predators sensing wounded prey. And somewhere, Alara was a prisoner. Again. Because of him. Because his need to possess her had painted a target on her back that his enemies had been waiting to exploit. Garrett entered without knocking, which was his privilege as the only person Riker trusted without reservation. The older warrior looked exhausted, his face creased with lines that hadn't been there a week ago. Found something? Garrett said. One of the stable boys saw a group leave through the southern gate the night of the attack. 6 riders, moving fast, with a wagon. He didn't report it because he thought it was a supply run we'd authorized. Where were they headed? South toward the Shadow Fen. But here's the interesting part. Garrett spread a map on the table, pointing to a region marked with warning symbols. The Shadow Fen is neutral territory. No single alpha claims it because the terrain's too hostile and the resources too scarce. But there's an old fortress there, pre-Empire. Some warlord stronghold from before your father's time. Who controls it now? Nobody officially. But there have been rumors of someone setting up operations there. Someone building a small army out of sight. We dismissed it as frontier gossip. Riker studied the map, mind racing. The Shadowfen was 3 days' hard ride. The terrain was treacherous, full of bogs that could swallow horses and men without warning. It was exactly the kind of place someone would choose if they wanted to operate beyond his reach. How many men can we mobilize? Garrett shook his head. That's the problem. You pull more warriors from the compound, and you leave it vulnerable to another attack. You march on the Shadowfen in force, and Marcus Thorne will be all over your northern territories before you get back. You're being pulled in 3 directions at once, and that's exactly what they want. Then I don't take an army, I take a strike team. Small, fast, lethal. That's suicide. Even if you find her, you'll be outnumbered. I'll take those odds. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something he'd never said before. Maybe you should let her go. Not because of politics or empire, but because of what this is doing to you. You're not thinking clearly. You're making decisions based on emotion instead of strategy. The Riker Vance I knew would never walk into an obvious trap because of one woman. The Riker Vance you knew died the moment I saw her, Riker said. And he meant it, because that was the terrible truth he'd been avoiding. Alara hadn't just challenged his authority or sparked his interest. She'd fundamentally altered who he was at the core. She'd made him human again, in a world where being human was a liability he couldn't afford. But he couldn't go back. Couldn't unlearn the way her defiance made him feel alive for the first time in years. Couldn't forget the moments when her eyes softened just slightly, suggesting that beneath her hatred, there might be something else. Something worth the cost. Obsession isn't rational. That's what makes it different from desire or even love, if such a thing exists outside of fairy tales and weak men's delusions. Obsession is the voice in your head that says this person, this thing, this goal is more important than food or sleep, or the empire you built with blood and broken bones. It's the cancer that eats everything else until only the want remains. Riker knew he was obsessed. Had known it from the first week when he'd caught himself ordering servants to report on whether Alara had eaten, whether she'd slept, whether she'd spoken his name even in anger. The recognition didn't change anything. If anything, it made the compulsion worse because now he couldn't even pretend it was justified by logic or strategy. This was pure need, primal and consuming, the kind of need that made men burn kingdoms just to feel warmth. He assembled his strike team by nightfall. 15 warriors, each one chosen for skills that went beyond simple combat. Trackers who could follow sign through hostile terrain. Scouts who could move silent as ghosts. Fighters who understood that sometimes you won by cutting throats in the dark rather than meeting enemies head-on in glorious battle. Garrett insisted on coming, despite Riker's initial refusal. "Your death means this empire collapses," Garrett said bluntly. "My death means you lose your best friend, but the throne remains stable. Those are acceptable odds." They rode out under cover of darkness, leaving the compound in the hands of the remaining council with strict orders to hold position and trust no one. Riker knew it was a risk, knew that every hour he spent away from the seat of power gave his enemies room to maneuver. But the alternative was leaving Alara in the hands of whoever had taken her, and that possibility was literally unthinkable. The Shadowfen lived up to its reputation. The land turned hostile the moment they crossed into its boundaries, solid ground giving way to marsh that required constant vigilance to navigate. Trees grew twisted and wrong, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The air tasted of rot and stagnant water. This was a place where nature itself seemed hostile to human presence. They traveled in silence, communicating through hand signals that had been developed over years of combat. Riker led from the front, his every sense alert for ambush or trap. The deeper they went, the more certain he became that this was exactly where his enemies wanted him. Isolated, vulnerable, far from the infrastructure of power that had made him untouchable. But he didn't care. That was the thing about obsession. It made you stupid in ways you recognized but couldn't prevent. On the third day, they found the fortress. It rose from the marsh like a broken tooth, all crumbling stone and moss-covered battlements. But the approach was anything but abandoned. Fresh trenches had been dug. Wooden spikes lined the perimeter. Guard towers that had been ruins were now manned with archers whose silhouettes were visible against the gray sky. Garrett crouched beside Riker in the tree line, both men studying the defenses through the early morning mist. "At least 200 men," Garrett whispered. "Professional soldiers, not rabble. Someone's been planning this for months. Who has that kind of resources? Someone with deep pockets and deeper patience." They withdrew to plan the assault, but before they could finalize anything, a single rider emerged from the fortress carrying a white flag. The man approached to within shouting distance and called out a message that made Riker's blood run cold. "The Alpha King is invited to parley. Come alone and unarmed to the main gate at sunset. Refuse, and Alara Quinn dies screaming." It was the most obvious trap in the world. Walking into an enemy stronghold without weapons or backup violated every principle of combat and survival that Riker had internalized over 30 years of violence. His warriors knew it. Garrett knew it. Hell, the messenger probably knew it. "You can't," Garrett said flatly when they were alone. "This is exactly what they want. They'll capture you, kill you, and parade your corpse to prove that the Alpha King is dead. The Empire fragments overnight. Then it fragments. Listen to yourself. You're about to throw away everything we've built for a woman who would rather see you dead than sit beside you, This isn't honor. It's not even love. It's fucking madness. Riker turned to face his oldest friend. You're right. About all of it. This is madness. This is suicide. This is every stupid mistake rolled into one catastrophically bad decision. But I'm going anyway because the alternative is living knowing I left her to die when I could have tried. And when you're dead? What then? Then you go back to the compound and hold it together as long as you can. Find someone worthy to take the throne. Someone who won't make the mistakes I did. Garrett's face contorted with frustration and something that looked like grief. After everything we've survived together, this is how it ends? You walking into an obvious execution because you can't let go of an obsession? We both knew I'd die violent. This way at least has purpose. There was nothing else to say. Riker spent the remaining hours preparing, though there wasn't much to prepare. He'd be walking in unarmed, which meant his only weapons would be his wits and his willingness to do whatever it took. Sunset came too fast and not fast enough. Riker walked toward the fortress gates alone, feeling the weight of his warrior's eyes on his back, feeling Garrett's silent fury and fear, feeling the first real brush of mortality he'd experienced in years, because this time the odds weren't in his favor. The gates opened as he approached. Armed men lined the walls, arrows nocked and ready. Riker walked through that gauntlet of death with his head high and his hands visible, refusing to show anything that might be interpreted as fear or hesitation. The courtyard inside was organized chaos. Soldiers everywhere, all bearing weapons and watching him with the mixture of awe and hatred that came with facing a legend you'd been told to kill. Riker cataloged faces, looking for the leader, looking for any sign of Alara. A voice rang out from the fortress steps. "Welcome, Alpha King. We've been expecting you." The speaker was a woman Riker didn't recognize at first. Then memory clicked into place, and cold recognition flooded through him. She'd been part of his council years ago, before a disagreement over expansion strategy had led to her quiet resignation. He'd let her go because she hadn't seemed worth the effort of a public execution. Her name was Thalia Reeves, and she stood on those steps like she owned them. Flanking her were soldiers bearing the crest of the Southern Alliance, which explained where her funding and manpower had come from. Thalia. Riker kept his voice level. "I underestimated you. Most people do." She descended the steps with measured grace. "That's always been my advantage. Men like you see a woman and think administrator, advisor, supporting role. You never imagine we might have our own ambitions. Where is she?" "Alive. For now." Talia gestured, and 2 guards dragged Alara out from a side building. She looked thinner than Riker remembered, with bruises on her face and arms that made something murderous rise in his chest. But her eyes were still defiant, still blazing with that inner fire that had hooked him from the beginning. "Riker," she said, and her voice carried both relief and anger. "You actually came, you stupid, arrogant fool." "Couldn't help myself," Riker said, and almost smiled despite the circumstances. Thalia laughed. "This is perfect. The mighty Alpha King, brought to his knees by a woman who despises him. Do you know how many people said it couldn't be done? That Riker Vance had no weaknesses, no pressure points, nothing human enough to exploit? But I knew better. I remembered the way you looked at her during that council meeting. The way you lost your composure when anyone questioned keeping her. She circled him like a predator. You built an empire on being untouchable, and then you touched her. Fatal mistake. You've made your point. Let her go and we can negotiate terms for whatever it is you actually want." "What I want?" Thalia stopped directly in front of him. "I want your empire. I want every territory you conquered, every alliance you forced, every resource you hoarded. And I'm going to get it because you just walked into my stronghold unarmed and alone. Your warriors outside will scatter once they realize you're not coming back. Marcus Thorne will sweep the northern territories while the Southern Alliance moves on your compound from below. By this time next week, the empire of Riker Vance will be a cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much." The soldiers moved in then, seizing Riker's arms, forcing him to his knees on the cold stone. He didn't resist because resistance was pointless, and because his mind was already racing ahead to possibilities and outcomes. "Don't hurt him," Alara said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "Whatever you're planning, leave him out of it." Thalia turned to her with mock sympathy. How sweet. The prisoner defending her captor. "Tell me, Alara, did you ever feel anything for him? Or was it always just fear and loathing? Alara met Riker's eyes across the courtyard, and something passed between them that had no words. I felt pity, she said finally, for a man so powerful he forgot what it meant to be human. The words hit harder than any blade. Riker knelt there in the dirt of his enemy's fortress and felt the last walls of his self-deception crumble. Because she was right. He'd spent so long being the Alpha King that he'd forgotten how to be anything else. And in trying to possess the one person who saw through his armor, he'd destroyed everything he'd built. Here's what nobody tells you about hitting bottom. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt of realization or sudden clarity. It's just a quiet moment when you look at the ruins of your choices and understand finally that you did this to yourself. That every catastrophe was predictable. That the warning signs were everywhere, and you ignored them because obsession doesn't listen to reason. Riker knelt in that courtyard and accepted his death. Not with resignation, but with something close to relief. Because at least it would end. The constant wanting, the grinding need, the empire that had become a cage, all of it would stop, and maybe that was mercy. But then Garrett's voice cut through the twilight like thunder. Now. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Riker's warriors had circled the fortress under cover of marsh fog, and now they struck with the precision of men who'd trained together for years. Arrows fell like rain. Grappling hooks caught battlements. Explosives that Garrett had somehow acquired blew sections of the wall inward. Chaos erupted. Talia's soldiers scattered, trying to mount a defense against an assault they hadn't anticipated. The men holding Riker hesitated just long enough for him to move. He drove his elbow back into one guard's throat, twisted to break the other's knee, and came up with a sword that felt like coming home. Then he was moving through the fight like violence incarnate, cutting through anyone between him and Alara. Bodies fell. Blood sprayed. The courtyard became an abattoir, and Riker was the butcher carving his way toward the only thing that mattered. He reached Alara as Thalia drew a blade and pressed it against her throat. The older woman's eyes were wild, her carefully laid plans dissolving into carnage. "Stay back!" Thalia screamed. "I'll kill her! I swear I'll kill her!" Riker stopped, sword dripping, chest heaving. Around them, the battle raged, but in that moment it was just the 3 of them in a bubble of terrible possibility. "Do it," Alara said quietly, looking at Riker. "Let her kill me. End this madness. Free yourself." "No. You don't get to choose, Riker. You never did." Tears ran down her face, mixing with blood from a cut above her eye. "I'm not your salvation. I'm not your prize. I'm just a woman who wanted to live her life, and you destroyed that because you couldn't understand the difference between possession and love." The blade pressed harder against her throat, drawing a thin line of blood. And Riker understood finally what it meant to truly lose. Not in battle or politics or the game of empires, but to lose in the only way that actually mattered. To recognize that the thing you wanted most was never yours to take, and that trying to keep it had turned you into exactly the monster she named you. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it with every broken piece of his soul. Then he dropped his sword. The courtyard went silent except for the crackle of flames and distant screams. Thalia stared at him in disbelief. "What are you doing? Letting her go!" Riker raised his hand, stepping back. "You want me, Thalia? You want the Alpha King? Here I am, unarmed, defeated. Let Alara walk out of here and you can have everything else. You're bluffing." "I'm not." He looked at Alara one last time, memorizing her face. "I was wrong. About everything. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved freedom, not a cage made of gold and obsession." He turned to Thalia. "My life for hers. That's the deal." Thalia's hand trembled on the blade. "This is a trick. It's surrender." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Garrett, seeing what Riker was doing, roared in fury and charged toward them. Thalia, panicking, swung the blade away from Alara's throat to defend herself. Alara, freed, stumbled forward into Riker's arms for just a second before pulling away. And in that second, Riker felt what he'd been chasing all along. Not possession or dominance or the satisfaction of conquest. Just the simple human connection of one person holding another in a world that tried to grind everyone down to nothing. Then Garrett was there, cutting through the last of Thalia's guards. The remaining enemy soldiers threw down their weapons as they realized the battle was lost. Thalia herself was subdued, disarmed, forced to her knees in the same spot where Riker had knelt minutes before. The fortress was theirs. the coup broken, the empire saved. But as Riker watched Alara walk toward the gates, toward freedom, toward a life that didn't include him, he understood that he'd lost the only war that mattered. She didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, just walked out into the gathering darkness like a ghost fading from a dream. Garrett put a hand on his shoulder. "We won." "No," Riker said quietly. "We didn't." Because victory was supposed to feel like something other than this hollowness. This recognition that power and empire and all the things he'd spent his life building were just elaborate distractions from the fundamental loneliness at the core of his existence. They returned to the compound 3 days later with prisoners and the heads of traitors, and news that the rebellion had been crushed. Marcus Thorne sued for peace when he heard what had happened at Shadowfen. The Southern Alliance withdrew their diplomatic overtures. The Empire stabilized, held together by the reputation of an Alpha King who'd walked into hell and come back out. But Riker sat on his throne of iron and wolf pelts and felt nothing. The Great Hall was packed with warriors celebrating their victory. The Council praised his strategic brilliance. Messengers brought news of territories reaffirming their loyalty. And all he could think about was Alara's face in that last moment before she walked away. The way she'd looked at him with something that might have been forgiveness or might have been final judgment. Garrett found him alone in his chambers after the celebrations wound down. The old warrior looked exhausted, his face showing every year and every scar. "She's gone," Garrett said. "Witnesses say she took one of our horses and headed west toward the free territories. She'll be safe there, beyond our reach." "Good. The Council wants to know your plans. Marcus Thorne is neutralized but not destroyed. The western borders need reinforcement. There are a dozen decisions that need your attention." Riker stared at the map spread across his table, at the empire that had cost him everything to build and everything to keep. "Tell them I need time." "Time for what?" "To figure out if any of this was worth it." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what the difference is between you and Talia? Between you and all the other would-be conquerors who tried and failed to do what you did?" "What? You actually built something worth keeping. She just wanted to tear it down out of spite. But you created order from chaos. You gave people stability, protection, a chance at something better than constant war. That has to count for something." "Does it?" Riker turns to face him. "I built an empire on fear and violence and the bones of everyone who opposed me. I turned myself into something barely human in pursuit of power. And when I finally felt something real, something that made me remember what it was like to be alive, I couldn't handle it without trying to control it, without turning it into just another thing to possess. So what now? You going to abdicate? Walk away from everything?" "No." Riker moved to the window, looking out over the compound that thrummed with life and purpose. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. Rule without obsession. Lead without letting my wants compromise my judgment. Build something that lasts beyond my need for it." "And Alara?" "I let her go. Really let her go. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. She deserves a life that isn't defined by me." He paused, feeling the words catch in his throat. "And maybe I deserve to live with the consequences of my choices instead of trying to escape them." Days turned to weeks. The Empire settled into its new normal. Marcus Thorne sent envoys to negotiate a formal peace that included trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. The Southern Alliance opened diplomatic channels. The territories that had been wavering reaffirmed their loyalty when they saw that the Alpha King had survived his moment of weakness and emerged harder for it. But Riker carried Alara's absence like a wound that wouldn't heal. He felt her in every decision he made, every moment he had to choose between what he wanted and what the Empire needed. She'd become the voice in his head asking whether this action served his people or just his pride, whether this choice came from strength or from the insecurity of a man trying to prove something to himself. Then one night, a messenger arrived at the compound gates. A woman traveling alone, exhausted from hard riding, carrying a sealed letter with no identifying marks. The guards brought her to Riker immediately because something about her urgency suggested this wasn't routine correspondence. Riker opened the letter in his private chambers with hands that trembled slightly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom made his heart stop. It was from Alara. The letter was short, just a few lines that rewrote everything he thought he understood. "Riker, I'm writing this because you deserve to know the truth. I hate you for what you did to me, for the cage you built and called it protection, for the choices you stole. But I also understand now that you were drowning in your own prison, and I was the first thing you saw that looked like air. That doesn't excuse it, but it makes you human instead of just monster. I'm safe in the free territories, building a life that's actually mine. Don't come looking for me. Don't send people to check on me. Let this be where it ends. But know that somewhere in the hatred and the fear and all the complicated mess of what happened between us, there was a moment when I saw who you could have been if the world hadn't turned you into what you are. I hope you find a way to become that person. I hope you build something better than what we had. Goodbye, Riker. Really goodbye this time. Elara. He read it 3 times. Then he burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken in the fireplace. The words were already carved into memory anyway, and having them on paper felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. But something shifted in him reading that letter, some final piece of the obsession releasing its grip, because she'd given him exactly what he needed. Not forgiveness or absolution or a door left open for reconciliation, just recognition that he was human after all, with all the failures and potential that implied. Riker stood at the window of his chambers and looked out over his empire. The compound sprawled below, full of people who depended on him to keep them safe and fed and alive in a brutal world that didn't give quarter to weakness. He'd built this, fought for it, nearly destroyed it through his own stupidity, but it was still here, still standing, and maybe that was enough. Maybe redemption wasn't about being forgiven by the people you'd hurt. Maybe it was about doing better going forward, making different choices, becoming the leader his people needed instead of the tyrant his pain had created. Garrett found him there an hour later, still staring out at the compound lights. "You all right?" "No." Riker turned to face his oldest friend. "But I will be. The council's asking about succession plans. They want to know if you're considering taking a mate, producing heirs to stabilize the line. Tell them I'm not ready for that conversation. Maybe never will be. We'll establish a council-based succession if necessary. That's a big change from how you've operated. Everything's a big change from how I've operated. That's the point." Garrett studied him for a long moment. "She really got to you, didn't she?" Riker nodded slowly. "She showed me what I'd become, and more importantly, what I could choose to be instead. That's either the greatest gift or the cruelest curse anyone's ever given me. Which is it? I'll let you know when I figure it out." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Riker's life, and that was saying something given the violence and loss that had marked his climb to power. Because it's one thing to fight external enemies, it's another thing entirely to fight yourself. To recognize the patterns of behavior that had served you well in one context but were actively destroying you in another. He found himself hesitating before making decisions, questioning motivations he used to act on without thought. Is this choice serving the Empire or serving my ego? Am I punishing this person because they deserve it or because they reminded me of my failure with Elara? Would I make this same decision if I weren't trying to prove I'm still strong after being brought to my knees? The council noticed the change. Some welcomed it, seeing a more measured and thoughtful leader emerging from the wreckage of obsession. Others worried that he'd lost his edge, that the ruthlessness that had built the Empire was being replaced by something too soft to maintain it. Marcus Thorne himself commented on it during their first face-to-face peace negotiations. "You're different," the former rebels said. "I expected the Alpha King to come in here demanding submission. Instead, you're actually listening." "I learned some hard lessons about the cost of not listening," Riker replied. "The woman?" Riker met his eyes. "Yes." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Riker with the calculating gaze of someone who'd survived by reading people accurately. "You know what's funny? All of us who challenged you, we thought your obsession was weakness. We saw it as the opening we needed to bring you down. But maybe it was actually the opposite. Maybe caring about something more than power was the first strong thing you'd done in years. Or maybe it was both," Riker said. "Weakness and strength. Like everything else." They signed the treaty that day, establishing borders and trade routes and mutual defense agreements that turned a decade of low-intensity conflict into something approaching actual peace. It wasn't friendship, but it was the foundation for something better than endless war. And Riker found himself thinking about Elara's letter again, about the idea that he could become who he might have been if the world hadn't turned him into what he was. Maybe he couldn't undo the past, couldn't take back the choices that had hurt her and damaged his empire, and turned him into something barely recognizable as human. But he could choose differently going forward. Could build something that lasted not through fear and domination, but through actual leadership, through earning loyalty instead of demanding it, through protecting people instead of possessing them. It wouldn't be redemption, that wasn't on the table, but it might be something close to growth. The sun set over the compound that night in shades of red and gold that reminded Riker of fire and blood. He stood on the battlements alone, watching his empire settle into evening. Somewhere out beyond those mountains, Alara was building a life without him. And he was here, surrounded by everything he'd fought for, finally understanding that power without purpose was just another kind of prison. Garrett joined him as full darkness fell, bringing 2 cups of whatever harsh liquor the compound was producing this season. To survival, Garrett said, raising his cup. Riker clinked his cup against Garrett's but didn't drink immediately. To becoming something worth surviving, he said instead. They stood there in companionable silence, 2 men who'd seen too much and lived too long, watching over an empire that had almost eaten them both alive. And in that moment, Riker felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not peace exactly, not happiness, but maybe the first small seed of the possibility that he could live with who he'd become and work toward being someone better. That would have to be enough, because it was all he had left. 3 months of careful rebuilding. 3 months of Riker forcing himself to lead with strategy instead of impulse, to listen instead of command, to ask whether his decisions served the Empire or just his wounded pride. 3 months of believing he might actually become something better than what he'd been. Then Garrett put a knife in his back. Not literally. That would have been cleaner. What Garrett did was worse because it came wrapped in concern and loyalty and all the language of friendship that Riker had trusted without question for 20 years. It started with small things Riker didn't notice at first because he was too focused on his own transformation. Council meetings where Garrett would subtly redirect conversations away from topics that might expose certain vulnerabilities. Reports that came to Riker's desk already filtered through his second-in-command's review. Decisions made in Riker's name while he was occupied with other matters, justified as necessary efficiency. The pattern only became visible in retrospect, which is how the best betrayals always work. You don't see the trap until you're already caught in it. The revelation came on a night when autumn rain hammered the compound walls and lightning turned the sky white. Riker was in his chambers reviewing supply manifests because even transformed Alpha Kings had to deal with mundane logistics. A messenger arrived, young and terrified, with news that had clearly been burning holes in his composure. "Speak," Riker said without looking up from the documents. The messenger's voice shook. "Sir, there's been an incident at the Eastern Armory. A shipment that was supposed to arrive 3 days ago never came. When I investigated, I found records showing it was rerouted, but the authorization signature was yours." Riker looked up then, attention fully engaged. "I didn't authorize any rerouting." "That's what I thought, sir." So I dug deeper. The messenger placed a folder on the desk with hands that trembled slightly. "There are 6 other shipments over the past 2 months, all rerouted, all with your signature. But the handwriting doesn't quite match your actual style. Someone's been forging your authorization. Show me." Riker spent the next hour comparing signatures, cross-referencing dates and locations, building a picture that made his blood run cold. Because whoever was doing this had intimate knowledge of his schedule, his habits, his patterns of delegation. This wasn't an outside enemy. This was someone so close they could predict when he'd be too distracted to notice discrepancies. The list of people with that kind of access was very short. He called for his head of security, a woman named Kira, who'd served loyally for 8 years. She arrived quickly, took one look at the document spread across his desk, and went pale. "How long have you known?" Riker asked quietly. Kira swallowed hard. 2 weeks. I've been trying to trace the full extent before bringing it to you. Sir, it's worse than supply rerouting. There are funds missing from the Treasury. Not huge amounts, but consistent, like someone's been skimming to build a separate operation. Who? I don't have proof yet, but the pattern suggests someone with authority to approve expenditures. Someone trusted enough that auditors wouldn't question their access. Riker felt something cold settle in his chest. Give me names. Kira hesitated, clearly not wanting to voice what they were both thinking. There are only 3 people with that level of access. You, Councilman Drake, and Commander Garrett Kane. Drake made sense as a suspect. He'd been vocal about disagreeing with Riker's recent changes in leadership style. But Garrett? Garrett, who'd stood beside him through 100 battles? Garrett, who'd risked his life at Shadowfen to save Riker from his own suicidal obsession? The idea was unthinkable, which made it exactly the kind of blind spot a skilled betrayer would exploit. "Bring me everything you have," Riker said. "Every document, every transaction, every piece of evidence you've collected. And Kira? Do this quietly. If there's a conspiracy, I want to know how deep it goes before we start making arrests." She left, and Riker sat alone in his chambers, feeling the foundations of his world shift beneath him. Because if Garrett had turned against him, then nothing was solid anymore. Every memory became suspect. Every moment of apparent loyalty could have been performance. 20 years of friendship might have been 20 years of patient planning. Here's what power does to relationships. It poisons them from the inside, because you can never be entirely sure whether someone serves you out of genuine loyalty or calculated self-interest. Riker had always known this intellectually, had built his empire on the assumption that fear was more reliable than love. But he'd made an exception for Garrett. Had believed that their shared history, the blood they'd spilled together, the times they'd saved each other's lives, that all of it created a bond that transcended politics. Now he had to consider the possibility that he'd been played from the beginning, that Garrett had stayed close not out of friendship but out of ambition, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, using Riker's trust as the weapon that would destroy him. The evidence Kira brought over the next 3 days was damning. Financial records showing systematic theft that had been going on for over a year. Supply manifests redirecting weapons and armor to a location in the Western Territories that wasn't on any official roster. Communication intercepts suggesting coordination with outside forces. And at the center of it all, authorization codes and signatures that pointed directly at Garrett Kane. But still, no smoking gun. Nothing that proved beyond doubt that Garrett himself was the architect, rather than a scapegoat being set up by someone else. Riker needed certainty before he could act, because accusing his second-in-command without ironclad proof would fracture the Empire's leadership at exactly the moment when stability was most crucial. So he did something he hated. He set a trap. Riker called a private council session with only his inner circle: himself, Garrett, Drake, and 3 other senior advisors. The agenda was a proposed expansion into neutral territory to the northwest, a move that would require significant resources and careful planning. But the real purpose was to feed different information to different people and see which version leaked. To Garrett alone, Riker mentioned that the expansion would begin in 2 weeks and would be funded by redirecting resources from the southern border defenses. To Drake, he said 3 weeks, and mentioned pulling troops from the eastern garrisons. To each advisor, slight variations in timing and logistics. Then he waited. 5 days later, Kira brought him intercepted communications from the Western Territories. Someone was mobilizing forces to strike at the southern border defenses in exactly 2 weeks, clearly expecting those positions to be weakened by resource redirection. The information Riker had given only to Garrett. Riker sat with that confirmation for a full day before acting. Not because he doubted the evidence anymore, but because accepting it meant accepting that the one person he'd trusted without reservation had been working to destroy him. It meant every moment of apparent friendship had been contaminated by ulterior motive. It meant he'd been fundamentally wrong about the most important relationship in his life. The rage came later. First was just numbness, a kind of emotional shutdown that felt like his psyche protecting itself from a truth too painful to process all at once. He called Garrett to his private chambers after nightfall. Rain was falling again, drumming on the roof in rhythms that sounded like war drums. Garrett arrived relaxed and unsuspecting, the easy confidence of someone who believed their deception was still intact. "You wanted to see me?" Riker gestured to a chair. "Sit. We need to talk." Something in his tone must have registered because Garrett's expression shifted slightly. Still casual, but with an edge of wariness that hadn't been there before. "Everything all right?" "That depends on your definition." Riker leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I've been thinking a lot about loyalty lately, about what it means, about how you know when someone's really with you versus when they're just pretending while they sharpen the knife." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Where's this coming from?" "I found some irregularities, supply shipments rerouted, funds missing from the treasury. Nothing huge, but consistent. The kind of systematic theft that takes planning and access. You think we have a traitor in the council? I know we do. Riker's voice was quiet, but it carried weight. The question is whether they're working alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. Garrett stood, his hand dropping instinctively toward the blade at his belt. You should have told me immediately. We can't afford internal threats, not when we're still recovering from Thalia's coup. I'm telling you now. Who do you suspect? Riker looked at his oldest friend and saw the performance clearly for the first time. The concern that was just slightly too practiced. The righteous anger that didn't quite reach his eyes. The body language of someone playing a role they'd rehearsed. You, Riker said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to pause. Garrett went very still, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to read. Shock. Calculation. Something that might have been regret, or might have been irritation at being caught. Then he laughed, and it was the saddest sound Riker had ever heard. How long have you known? 5 days with certainty, longer with suspicion. Garrett moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked compound. His shoulders sagged slightly, the confident warrior posture giving way to something more honest. I wondered if you'd figure it out. Part of me hoped you would. This whole thing has gotten so much more complicated than it was supposed to be. Enlighten me. How complicated is betraying your closest friend? Garrett turned and his face held genuine pain. That's the thing, Riker. You were never supposed to be my friend. You were supposed to be a means to an end. But somewhere along the way, 20 years of fighting beside you, saving your life, having you save mine, all of it became real. And I started to hate myself for what I was planning. Then why not stop? Because I'd already set too much in motion. Because backing out would have gotten me killed by the people I'd made deals with. Because I convinced myself that what I was building was better than what you'd created, even if the cost was our friendship. What are you building? Garrett laughed again. An empire that doesn't depend on one man. A system where power is distributed instead of concentrated. Where leaders are chosen for competence instead of combatability. Everything you built is impressive, Riker, but it's fragile. It only works as long as you're alive and strong. The moment you die or weaken, it all falls apart. I've been constructing the framework for something more stable, by stealing from me, by forging my signatures, by coordinating with my enemies, by doing what was necessary. Garrett's voice hardened. You're not the only one who's allowed to make ruthless choices in service of a greater vision. You built this empire on violence and fear. I'm trying to build something that can survive without requiring a monster at the helm. The words hit like physical blows. Because there was truth in them, however twisted. Riker had built his empire on exactly the principles Garrett was criticizing, had ruled through domination because it was the only language he understood, and even his recent attempts at transformation were just one man's choices, easily reversed by whoever came after him. But none of that justified betrayal. You could have talked to me, Riker said, could have proposed these changes openly instead of working behind my back. Would you have listened? Garrett challenged. Be honest. Before Alara broke something open inside you, would you have accepted anyone suggesting you distribute your power? Would you have considered stepping back to let a council rule? No, probably not. Exactly. So I did what I had to do. And if you'd never changed, if you'd stayed the tyrant you were becoming, I wouldn't feel guilty about it. But you did change. You started becoming the kind of leader who might actually implement reforms without requiring a coup. And now I'm sitting here realizing I might be destroying the best chance at a peaceful transition this empire will ever have. Riker absorbed that in silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. The weight of the moment pressed down on both men, all the years and blood and shared history crushed into this single conversation. Here's what nobody tells you about betrayal. It's never simple. The people who hurt you aren't cartoon villains twirling mustaches. They're complicated humans with their own justifications and pain and vision of what the world should be. Sometimes they're even right about their criticisms, even as they're wrong about their methods. Garrett wasn't evil. He was ambitious and impatient and willing to sacrifice personal loyalty for what he saw as a greater good. That didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it made it harder to respond with simple rage. What happens now? Garrett asked quietly. Riker considered his options. He could have Garrett arrested, tried, executed as a traitor. It would be just. It would send a clear message about the cost of betrayal. It would eliminate a clear and present danger to his rule. It would also destroy the man who'd saved his life more times than either of them could count. Would turn 20 years of genuine friendship, however complicated by ulterior motives, into nothing but a cautionary tale. And it would waste someone whose vision for distributed power, however treacherously pursued, might actually be what the Empire needed to survive long term. "You're going to work for me," Riker said finally. Openly this time. "You're going to take all those ideas about distributed governance and systematic reform, and you're going to help me implement them legitimately." Garrett stared at him. "You're not serious." "I'm completely serious. You're right that this empire is too dependent on me. Right that we need structures that outlast any single leader. You're just wrong about needing to destroy me to build them." He moved closer. "Here's the deal. You confess everything to the full council. You return every resource you've stolen. You burn every alliance you've made with my enemies. And then you help me build the empire you claim to want, except we do it together instead of you stabbing me in the back. And if I refuse, then I execute you for treason and everything you worked for dies with you. Your distributed governance becomes a footnote in a cautionary tale about the cost of betrayal. You get to be the villain instead of the visionary." Garrett was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Why? After everything I've done, why would you give me this chance?" Because Alara was right about something. Power without growth is just tyranny in a fancy chair. I need people around me who'll challenge my instincts, who'll push me toward being better than my worst impulses. You've proven you're willing to do that, even if your methods were catastrophically wrong. He paused. "And because despite everything, you're still the closest thing I have to family. I'd rather salvage that if possible. I don't deserve this." "Probably not. But maybe that's the point. Maybe grace isn't about deserving. It's about choosing something other than the endless cycle of violence and revenge that's defined this empire from the beginning." Garrett's face worked through a dozen emotions. Then, slowly, he knelt. Not in submission, but in something more complex. Acknowledgement, gratitude, shame, relief. "I accept," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. For all of it." The council meeting the next morning was brutal. Garrett stood before the assembled leadership and confessed everything. The theft, the forged authorizations, the coordination with outside forces, the year-long conspiracy to undermine Riker's rule and establish a different system of governance. The room erupted in fury. Council members called for immediate execution. Warriors who'd served under Garrett for years felt betrayed and demanded blood. The compound itself seemed to vibrate with rage and disbelief. Riker let it rage for several minutes before standing. His presence alone was enough to bring silence. "Everything Garrett said is true," Riker began. "He betrayed my trust. He worked against this empire's stability. By every law and custom we hold, he's earned execution." The crowd murmured approval. "But I'm not going to execute him." The murmur turned to shocked protest. Riker raised a hand, not because his crimes don't warrant it, but because his vision for this empire's future, however treacherously pursued, contains ideas worth considering. He's right that we're too dependent on single-leader dominance. Right that we need systems that can outlast any individual. Right that power needs to be distributed to be sustainable. Councilman Drake stood, his face flushed. "You're rewarding treason. I'm recognizing that destroying the man doesn't destroy the problems he identified." Riker's voice hardened. "Every one of you sitting at this table has benefited from my absolute authority. You've enjoyed the stability it brought while ignoring the fragility it created. Garrett forced us to confront that fragility, and we're going to use his expertise to address it." He turned to Garrett. "You're going to spend the next year helping me build the distributed governance system you claim to believe in. You'll work openly. You'll report to the full council, and if you betray this second chance, I'll kill you myself." The council was split. Half thought Riker had lost his mind. Half saw the strategic brilliance of turning an enemy's expertise towards strengthening rather than destroying the empire. The debate raged for hours. In the end, Riker's authority carried the decision. Garrett would live, would work, would help build something new from the ashes of his betrayal. But trust, once broken, doesn't heal cleanly. Over the following weeks, Riker and Garrett worked together with the careful distance of two men navigating a minefield. They developed proposals for regional councils with real authority. They created oversight systems that distributed financial control. They designed succession protocols that didn't rely on combat dominance. It was good work, necessary work that would genuinely make the empire more resilient and just. But between them, a chasm had opened that no amount of shared purpose could fully bridge. They were professional, respectful, occasionally even collaborative. But the ease of their old friendship was gone, replaced by wariness and barely healed wounds. Riker caught himself sometimes late at night, wondering if he'd made the right choice, whether mercy was wisdom or just another manifestation of the weakness that had nearly destroyed him with Alara, whether forgiveness was strength or an invitation for the next betrayal. Then news came from the Western territories that shattered whatever fragile equilibrium they'd achieved. Alara had been captured. The report came from one of Riker's intelligence operatives embedded in the Free Territories. She'd been living in a small settlement, working as a healer, building exactly the quiet life she'd wanted. Then a raiding party hit the settlement. Not random bandits, but organized soldiers bearing the crest of the Southern Alliance. They'd taken her specifically, left others who would have been valuable slaves, burned only the buildings that might have contained evidence of her presence. This was a targeted extraction. And the message that came with the report made Riker's blood freeze. We have Alara Quinn, the woman the Alpha King obsessed over, the weakness that nearly destroyed his empire. If Riker Vance wants her back, he'll abdicate his throne and submit to Southern Alliance authority. He has 1 week to comply. Otherwise, we start sending pieces. Riker read the message 3 times, each reading stoking a rage he thought he'd learned to control. This wasn't about Alara. This was about using her to destroy him politically, force him to choose between the Empire and the woman who'd already cost him so much. It was brilliant strategy, cruel and brilliant. Garrett found him in his chambers, staring at the message. Without a word, Garrett read it over his shoulder. It's a trap, Garrett said quietly. Obviously. They're betting you'll choose her over everything else. That obsession will override strategy like it did before. They're betting wrong. Are they? Garrett moved to stand in front of him. Be honest. You've changed, but has that changed? Would you actually let her die to preserve your throne? Riker met his eyes. I don't know. And that terrifies me more than any external threat. The council convened within the hour. The debate was exactly what Riker expected. Half argued that Alara's fate was irrelevant to Empire business, that giving in to extortion would show weakness that would invite more attacks. The other half worried that refusing would make Riker seem heartless, would undermine the more humane leadership style he'd been cultivating. Drake put it most bluntly. You already nearly destroyed us over this woman. Are you going to finish the job by actually handing them the Empire? Riker didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated and ugly and spoke to the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his transformation. He'd been trying to become less of a tyrant, more capable of seeing people as humans instead of resources or obstacles. But that growth meant Alara's suffering mattered to him in ways that made purely strategic thinking nearly impossible. Here's the brutal reality of trying to change your nature while still holding power. Every soft choice can be exploited. Every moment of compassion becomes a pressure point. The qualities that make you more human also make you more vulnerable. And your enemies will absolutely use that vulnerability to destroy everything you've built. Riker had learned to care, had started seeing the people under his rule as more than abstract resources to deploy. And now that very growth was being weaponized against him. Garrett spoke into the silence. There might be a third option. We don't comply with their demands, but we also don't abandon her. We extract her. With what army? Drake demanded. We're still rebuilding from Thalia's coup and your betrayal. We can't afford to provoke the Southern Alliance into open war. Not an army, a strike team, like at Shadowfen. Garrett looked at Riker, small, fast, surgical, in and out before they can mobilize a response. It's still a trap, someone else objected. They'll be expecting exactly that kind of rescue attempt. Probably, Garrett agreed, which is why we don't do it the way they expect. Over the next 2 days, they planned an operation that was either audacious brilliance or suicidal stupidity. Instead of a direct assault, they would infiltrate the Southern Alliance's capital during a major festival when security would be focused on crowd control rather than perimeter defense. Riker would go personally, along with a small team of specialists disguised as merchants. The council hated it. Too risky. Too many variables. Too dependent on the Alpha King personally putting himself in mortal danger for one person who'd explicitly told him to leave her alone. But Riker was done letting fear of risk prevent right action, done letting political calculation override every human instinct. "I'm going," he said flatly. "Anyone who wants to stop me can try." No one tried. The journey south took 4 days of hard travel through increasingly hostile territory. Riker's team consisted of 6 warriors chosen for intelligence and adaptability rather than just combat prowess. Garrett insisted on coming despite the fragile trust between them, arguing that if this went wrong, he had the most experience pulling Riker out of his own bad decisions. They entered the Southern Alliance capital on the 2nd day of the Harvest Festival. The city was magnificent in ways Riker's compound could never be, all gleaming white stone and gardens that spoke to centuries of accumulated wealth. This was what civilization looked like when it wasn't constantly preparing for war. It made Riker's empire seem brutal and crude by comparison, made him wonder what he might have built if he'd valued beauty and culture as much as strength and security. But there was no time for philosophy. They had 3 days to locate Alara, plan an extraction, and execute it before the festival ended and security tightened again. Their intelligence contact was a woman named Sarah, who'd been providing information to Riker's network for years. She met them in a back room of an unremarkable tavern and spread out rough maps of the government complex. They're holding her in the Eastern Wing. High security, but not maximum. They want her accessible enough to produce for execution if Riker doesn't comply with demands. How many guards? 30 minimum. More if they've anticipated a rescue attempt. Sarah tapped the map. Your best approach is through the old water channels. They're not guarded because they're supposedly too narrow for adults. But if your people are flexible enough, they can get inside. And once we're in, then you've got about 10 minutes before someone raises the alarm. After that, you're fighting your way out through a city that hates you with every guard in the capital trying to kill you. Riker studied the maps in silence. This was insanity. The odds of success were minimal. The cost of failure would be his death and probably the collapse of his empire. But the alternative was living with the knowledge that he'd let Alara die to preserve his political position, that he'd learned to be strategic, but lost whatever made him human in the process. "We go tomorrow night," he said, "during the main festival ceremony when most of the city will be distracted." The infiltration went perfectly until it didn't. They made it through the water channels with painful slowness, their bodies scraped raw by tight stone passages. They emerged in the lower levels of the government complex, exactly where Sarah's intelligence suggested. They moved through corridors with professional silence, taking out 3 guards without raising alarm. Then they opened the door to Alara's cell and found it empty. Riker stood in that vacant room feeling reality tilt. The bed showed signs of recent occupation. The chamber pot was half full. But Alara was gone. "It's a trap," Garrett hissed. "We need to leave now." Riker's mind raced through possibilities and probabilities. They'd been set up from the beginning, lured here. The question was whether the goal was capture or just to get him out of his compound while something else happened. Then a voice spoke from the doorway behind them, cultured and amused. "Welcome, Alpha King. We've been expecting you." 20 guards flooded the corridor, weapons drawn, blocking every exit. And standing at their center was someone Riker recognized from diplomatic reports. Lord Chancellor Vren, the de facto ruler of the Southern Alliance. He was thin and elegant in ways that made Riker's warrior build seem crude. His smile held genuine delight. "You're so predictable," Vren said. "We gambled that obsession would override caution, and here you are, walked right into our capital. Brought your key personnel, left your empire vulnerable." He gestured and more guards appeared, these ones hauling someone between them. Alara. She looked worse than at Shadowfin, thinner, bruised, but her eyes blazed with that familiar defiance when they met Riker's. "You idiot," she said. "I told you to leave me alone." "Couldn't help myself," Riker replied, and despite everything, almost smiled. Vren laughed. "This is perfect. We have the Alpha King, his second in command, and the woman who broke him. The Empire will be in chaos within days. Our forces are already moving on your northern territories. By the time news of your capture reaches your compound, we'll control half your holdings." Riker felt the trap close completely around him. Not just physical capture, but strategic checkmate. Even if he somehow fought his way out of this room, his empire was already being dismantled. Every choice led to catastrophic loss. Here's what total defeat feels like. It's not the physical danger, though, that's real enough. It's the recognition that you've been outplayed at every level, that your attempt at growth and change became the very weakness your enemies exploited, that trying to be better than your worst instincts just gave them more ways to destroy you. Riker looked at Alara, at Garrett, at the warriors who'd followed him into this disaster, saw his empire fracturing in real time, saw every choice he'd made since pulling Alara from that village leading inevitably to this moment, and understood, finally, that transformation had a cost he hadn't been willing to acknowledge. You couldn't be both the ruthless Alpha King and the man capable of growth, couldn't hold absolute power while developing genuine human connections. The two things were fundamentally incompatible, which meant only one path forward. Riker straightened, meeting Vren's eyes. You want my abdication? You'll get it. But on my terms. The Chancellor raised an eyebrow. You're not in a position to negotiate terms, aren't I? If you kill me, I become a martyr. My people rally around my memory and fight you forever. If you hold me prisoner, same result with the added complication of constant rescue attempts. But if I voluntarily step down and endorse a successor, you get a peaceful transition and stability. Why would you do that? Because I'm tired, Riker said simply. Tired of the violence, tired of the political games, tired of being the monster everyone needs me to be. He gestured at Garrett. My second-in-command has been building systems for distributed governance. Give him the authority to implement them. Transform my empire into something that doesn't require a tyrant at the helm. You get regional stability. My people get a better future. Everyone wins. Except you, Vren said softly. Except me. Alara's voice cut through the tension. Don't throw away everything you built because of me. Riker finally looked at her fully. I'm not. I'm throwing it away because it was always going to collapse under its own weight. You just helped me see that sooner rather than later. He turned back to Vren. Do we have a deal? The Chancellor studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. We have a deal. With conditions. Name them. You leave this city and never return. You have no role in governance, no influence over policy, no contact with your former territories. You disappear completely. Become a ghost. Riker felt the full weight of what he was agreeing to. Exile. Irrelevance. The complete dismantling of his identity as the Alpha King, everything he'd built and fought for handed to someone else while he faded into nothing. But the alternative was more death, more violence, more years of being the monster who held an empire together through sheer brutal force. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to finally discover who Riker Vance was when he wasn't being the Alpha King. Agreed, he said. The room erupted in protest, his warriors refusing to accept it, Garrett demanding he reconsider, even Alara arguing that this was madness. But Riker had made his choice, and for the first time in his entire violent life, it was a choice based not on what served power, but on what served growth. Not on dominance, but on acceptance that some things couldn't be held by force. Vren gestured and guards moved forward with chains. They're not necessary, Riker said quietly. I gave my word. The chains went on anyway, because trust was for fools and everyone in that room understood it. As they led him away, Riker caught Alara's eyes one final time. She was crying, which surprised him. He'd expected relief or maybe satisfaction that he'd finally paid for his obsession. Instead, he saw grief. For him. For what he'd been and what he was becoming. For the terrible cost of trying to change too late. I'm sorry, she mouthed. Riker shook his head slightly. I'm not. Because he wasn't. Not anymore. This was the price of becoming human again, of caring about something more than power, of recognizing that the strength to let go was harder and more valuable than the strength to hold on. They took him to a cell deep beneath the complex, stripped him of every symbol of authority, left him alone in darkness that was oddly comforting after years of carrying the weight of an empire. And Riker sat in that darkness and felt lighter than he had in decades, because the burden was finally gone. The crown, the throne, the constant weight of being something larger than human. He'd lost everything, his empire, his power, his identity as the Alpha King. But somewhere in that loss was the first genuine freedom he'd felt since he was a boy fighting for scraps in Greywater's slums. The question was whether he could survive being just Riker Vance. whether there was enough left beneath the armor to build a life that didn't require dominance and violence. He didn't know, but for the first time he was willing to find out, even if it meant burning everything else down to discover the answer. The cell was silence and darkness for 3 days. No interrogation, no torture, just the absence of everything that had defined Riker Vance for 30 years. No empire to rule, no decisions to make, no weight of authority pressing down on his shoulders like armor he could never remove. Just a man alone with the wreckage of his choices. The guards brought food twice daily. Thin gruel and stale bread that Riker ate mechanically because survival was still instinct, even when purpose had evaporated. They didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge him as anything other than a problem temporarily contained. On the 4th day, everything changed. The explosion came at dawn. Not close enough to damage his cell, but loud enough to shake dust from the ceiling and send the guards outside scrambling. Riker was on his feet immediately, pressed against the door, listening to chaos erupt through the complex. Another explosion. Closer this time. Then the distinctive sound of steel on steel. Combat. Professional and brutal. Someone was attacking the Southern Alliance capital. The door to his cell burst open. Riker tensed, ready to fight with bare hands if necessary. But the figure in the doorway made him freeze. Elara stood there in borrowed armor that didn't quite fit, holding a sword like she'd been born to it, breathing hard. Her face was streaked with smoke and determination. "Move," she said. "We don't have much time. What are you doing? Saving your stubborn ass. You coming or not?" Riker didn't ask more questions. Didn't waste time on explanations that could wait until they weren't in immediate danger of death. He followed her out into a corridor that had become a war zone. Bodies littered the floor. Southern Alliance guards cut down with precision that spoke to military training. Elara moved through the carnage like she'd done this before, which was impossible because the last time Riker had seen her, she'd been a healer in a peaceful settlement. "Where did you learn to fight?" he asked as they ran. "I didn't, but the people who came to rescue you did." She glanced back at him. "Turns out your empire doesn't fall apart just because you decide to quit." They emerged into a courtyard where absolute chaos reigned. Riker's warriors, the ones he'd brought south, were fighting alongside what looked like a full company of his northern troops. Somehow they'd infiltrated the capital in force, coordinated this assault, and were now carving a bloody path toward extraction. And leading them was Garrett Kane, moving through the fight like violence incarnate. Riker felt something complicated twist in his chest. Betrayal and gratitude and fury all mixed into an emotion too complex to name. Because Garrett had orchestrated the conspiracy that undermined his rule, then turned around and launched a suicidal rescue mission that violated every term of the agreement Riker had made. Garrett saw them, and his face split into a grin that was all teeth and battlefield joy. "About time. Thought I'd have to burn this whole city down to find you." "I told you not to come," Riker said, though he was already moving toward weapons scattered on the ground, already feeling his body remember what it was to be a warrior instead of a prisoner. "Yeah, well, I never was good at following orders." Garrett tossed him a sword. "Besides, your empire's falling apart without you. Figured I'd bring you back before the whole thing collapsed. I abdicated. I gave my word." And Vren broke his. Garrett's expression hardened. Soon as we left, he started executing prisoners. Anyone with ties to your territories. Men, women, didn't matter. Said he was cleansing the region of your influence. He gestured at the carnage around them. "So I decided your word to a man with no honor isn't binding. Here's what you need to understand about the difference between strategy and principle. Strategy is flexible. You make deals, break them when necessary, adapt to changing circumstances. It's pure calculation in service of desired outcomes. Principle is rigid. You set a standard and hold to it even when it costs you, even when breaking it would be tactically advantageous, even when everyone would understand if you made an exception. Riker had spent his entire life being strategic, making whatever choices served his empire's growth and stability. Breaking his word to Vren should have been easy, justified by the man's own betrayal. But something in him had shifted during those days in the cell. Some fundamental recognition that he was tired of being the man who made exceptions to every principle when it suited him. Tired of the endless flexibility that made him effective but hollow. "We had a deal," Riker said quietly. Garrett stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "They're killing our people. The Empire needs you. And you're worried about keeping your word to someone who wiped his ass with his own promises? Yes. Then you're more broken than I thought. Garrett turned back to the fight. We're leaving. You can come willingly, or I'll have my men carry you. Riker looked around the courtyard, at his warriors fighting and dying to rescue him from a captivity he'd chosen. At Alara standing there with a sword in her hands and fire in her eyes, having risked everything to free him. At the chaos his existence had created simply by being who he was, and made a choice that went against every instinct of survival and power he'd ever developed. No, he said. The word cut through the combat noise like a blade. Warriors nearby turned, uncertainty flickering across their faces. We're not leaving, Riker continued. We're surrendering. Garrett's face went white. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Riker raised his voice so everyone could hear. Stand down, all of you. We're not fighting our way out of this. The hell we aren't, one of his warriors shouted. We came to bring you home, sir, and I'm grateful. But this assault just gave Vren everything he needs to justify total war against our territories. Every person who dies here is ammunition for him to paint us as the aggressors. We play into his hands by fighting. So what's your plan? Garrett demanded. Let them execute all of us? No. I negotiate. Actually negotiate this time instead of walking into obvious traps. With what leverage? You're in his capital, outnumbered 100 to 1, having just launched an attack on his government complex. You have no leverage. Riker looked at Alara. Yes, I do. She understood immediately. Her expression shifted from determination to horror. No, don't you dare. I have the one thing Vren wants more than territory or resources. He wants to break the legend of the Alpha King, prove that I'm just a man who can be defeated. I give him that publicly, on his terms, and he has no reason to massacre our people. That's not leverage, Garrett said. That's suicide. Maybe, but it stops the bleeding, gives you time to implement those distributed governance reforms without me as a complication, gives the Empire a chance to become something better than what I built. The silence that followed was broken only by distant sounds of Southern Alliance reinforcements mobilizing. Riker's warriors looked at each other, at Garrett, at the man who'd led them through 100 battles and was now asking them to surrender. Alara moved closer, her voice low and fierce. I didn't risk everything to watch you martyr yourself. I'm not martyring myself. I'm accepting consequences. There's a difference. Riker met her eyes. You told me once that I needed to let go. That possession wasn't love and control wasn't protection. I'm finally listening. By getting yourself killed? By choosing something other than violence for once in my life. Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut across the courtyard. How touching. Lord Chancellor Vren stood at the entrance with 50 guards, more flooding in behind him. The Alpha King finally learns humility. Too late to matter, but character growth is always worth noting. Riker stepped forward, away from his warriors. My people stand down. This assault was unauthorized, launched against my explicit orders. I take full responsibility. Vren laughed. You think that matters? You attacked my capital, killed my guards. That demands response regardless of who gave orders. Then respond to me. Execute me publicly if that's what you need. But let my people return home. They were following orders from a commander who no longer has authority. Punishing them serves no purpose. Everything serves purpose, Alpha King. Vren gestured and guards moved forward. Your execution proves you're mortal. Their execution proves the cost of following you. Both lessons are valuable. Riker felt rage building in his chest, the old familiar fury that had solved problems through overwhelming violence. His hand tightened on the sword he'd picked up. He could fight. Could probably take 10 or 15 guards before they brought him down. Could make his death mean something other than defeat. But that was the old pattern. The cycle of violence that never ended because someone always had to get the last word, the final strike, the ultimate dominance. He opened his hand, let the sword fall. The clatter of steel on stone echoed through the courtyard. Riker raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of complete surrender. I'm done, he said. Done fighting. Done trying to control outcomes through force. You want to execute me? Do it. But let my people go home. Vren studied him for a long moment, then slowly smiled. No, I don't think I will. He gestured and guards surged forward, but not toward Riker, toward his warriors. toward Garrett and Alara and everyone who'd come to rescue him. Riker's surrender had been for nothing. Vren was going to kill them all anyway, and use the massacre to justify seizing northern territories while they were leaderless and vulnerable. Here's what happens when you trust that principles will protect you in a world built on violence and power. They don't. The people willing to murder and betray will always have tactical advantage over those constrained by honor. That's why empires are built by men like Riker used to be, not men trying to grow beyond their worst instincts. But here's what else happens. Sometimes the people around you refuse to let your principles become suicide. Sometimes they love you enough to be strategic when you're being suicidal. Garrett moved before Riker could. A knife appeared in his hand from nowhere, thrown with deadly precision. It took Vren in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Then Garrett was roaring orders, and Riker's warriors were fighting again, not for conquest, but for survival. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Southern Alliance guards trying to contain a force that had come here ready to die. Riker's people fighting with the desperate fury of those who knew they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered but refused to go down without resistance. Alara grabbed Riker's arm. "We need to move. Now. I'm not fighting." "Then don't fight, but don't stand here and let them kill you out of principle either." She pulled him toward a side corridor. "There's a difference between growth and stupidity. Figure out which one you're choosing." They ran through passages that Alara somehow knew, past guard posts she'd apparently scouted, toward an exit she'd planned before ever entering the complex. Behind them, the sounds of combat faded into distance, but not memory. They emerged into a back alley where horses waited. Riker recognized them as some of his own, which meant someone had planned this extraction with more care than he'd given credit for. "How?" he asked. Alara swung into a saddle with practiced ease. Turns out when you spend months in captivity, you get creative about escape routes. And when the Alpha King's second-in-command shows up asking for help rescuing his leader, you provide intelligence. Garrett was in on this from the beginning, from the moment Vren started executing prisoners. She kicked her horse into motion. "Now ride before I change my mind about saving you." They fled south, then circled west, avoiding main roads and traveling through terrain too rough for organized pursuit. Riker rode in silence, his mind trying to process the rapid sequence of events that had turned his principled surrender into violent escape. By nightfall, they'd linked up with the rest of Garrett's forces camped in hills outside the capital. 200 warriors, more than Riker had realized, were part of the assault. Not enough to take the city, but plenty to create chaos and extract a prisoner. Garrett was waiting, his shoulder bandaged where a blade had grazed him during the fight. His expression when he saw Riker was complicated. Relief and fury and something that might have been disappointment. "You almost got everyone killed," Garrett said flatly. "I was trying to prevent more killing. By surrendering to someone who was going to kill us anyway? That's not principle. That's naivety." Garrett moved closer. "You want to change? Fine. Become a better leader. But don't confuse growth with losing your survival instinct. The Empire needs you alive, not martyred on some altar of redemption." "I don't want the Empire. Too bad. It wants you." Garrett gestured at the camp. "Every one of these warriors is here because you built something worth defending. Because you created order from chaos and gave people something to believe in. You don't get to just walk away from that because you're tired of the wait." Riker looked around at the faces watching him. Warriors who'd followed him through hell, who'd risked everything on a suicidal rescue because they believed the Empire needed its Alpha King, who refused to let him quit even when quitting was the most principled choice, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, but opening. Some recognition that maybe transformation wasn't about abandoning everything he'd been. Maybe it was about integrating the best of his strength with the growth he'd fought for. "What's happening at home?" he asked quietly. "Chaos." Garrett's voice was grim. "When word spread that you'd been captured, 3 regional governors declared independence. Marcus Thorne is consolidating northern territories under his own authority. The council is fractured between those who want to rescue you and those who think your era is over." He paused. "We have maybe a week before the Empire fractures beyond repair. Then we don't have time for me to be conflicted about this." "No, we don't." Riker turned to face his assembled warriors. His voice carried across the camp with the authority of someone who'd commanded armies and built empires. "Here's what's going to happen. We return home, we stabilize the territories, We remind every governor and warlord and opportunistic rebel why they bent the knee in the first place. But we do it differently this time. How? Someone called out. By building the distributed governance Garrett designed. By giving regions real authority instead of just taking orders. By creating a system where my death doesn't mean the empire's collapse. He looked at Garrett. You were right that it was too dependent on me. But the solution isn't my abdication. It's evolution. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I can work with that. The march home took 6 days of forced pace through hostile territory. They avoided Southern Alliance patrols and fought through 2 ambushes from opportunistic bandits who thought a reduced force meant easy prey. They learned otherwise in blood and broken bodies. Riker fought in those skirmishes like he hadn't fought in months. Not with the cold calculation of strategic necessity, but with something approaching joy. Because this was who he was at the core. A warrior, a survivor. Someone who thrived in the crucible of violence, not because he loved killing, but because it was the only language he'd ever fully understood. But now, finally, he could acknowledge that without letting it define everything. Could be the Alpha King when necessary, while working toward a future where that role was less necessary. Alara rode beside him through most of the journey. They didn't talk much, but her presence was a constant reminder of what his obsession had cost. Of the woman who'd been collateral damage in his inability to separate wanting from possessing. On the 5th night, she finally spoke what had been building between them. When this is over, I'm leaving again. I know. I mean it this time. No guards, no towers, no possession disguised as protection. I understand. Do you? Because you say that. But then something in your eyes suggests you're already planning how to keep me close. Riker was quiet for a long moment, then said something that cost him more than any battlefield wound. You were right. About everything. I turned love into control because I didn't know any other way to hold on to something precious. But that wasn't love. It was fear dressed up as strength. He met her eyes. So when this is over, you walk away. And I let you, really let you this time. Alara's expression softened slightly. That might be the most grown-up thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it. I'm still figuring out this whole emotional maturity thing. She almost smiled. Then her face grew serious. What happened in that cell? What changed? I died. Riker looked at the mountains rising in the distance. Not physically, but the Alpha King died. And I had to decide if there was anyone left under that armor. If Riker Vance could exist without the Empire and the throne and the absolute power. He paused. Turns out there is. He's just been buried for so long I forgot what he looked like. And he's tired, broken, scarred by decades of violence and bad choices. But he's still breathing, still capable of growth if he stops long enough to do the work. Alara was silent. Then she reached out and touched his hand briefly. For what it's worth, I hope you find him. The man under the monster. I think he might be worth knowing. The compound came into view on the 7th day. Riker sat his horse on a ridge overlooking his empire and felt the weight of it settle back onto his shoulders. Not oppressive this time, but purposeful. This was his responsibility, his creation, his chance to build something better than what had come before. Smoke rose from several buildings. Signs of fighting. The gates were closed and heavily fortified. Whatever had happened in his absence, it hadn't been peaceful. Garrett rode up beside him. Marcus Thorne seized the northern territories like we expected, but he hasn't moved on the compound yet, probably waiting to see if you actually make it back. Smart. Riker studied the fortifications. Who's holding the compound? Kira. She rallied the guards and secured the inner walls. Lost some territory, but kept the core intact. Good. Get me inside. We need to call a council meeting and start putting this back together. What about Marcus? We deal with him after we stabilize internally. One crisis at a time. They descended toward the compound, and word spread ahead of them. By the time they reached the gates, a crowd had gathered. Warriors, civilians, council members, all watching to see if the Alpha King had actually returned or if this was some elaborate trick. Riker rode through those gates and felt the compound's energy shift. Fear giving way to hope. Chaos organizing into purpose. The presence of strong leadership changing everything even before words were spoken. Kira met him in the courtyard, looking exhausted but relieved. Welcome back, sir. We held it together as best we could. You did well. Riker dismounted, every muscle screaming from days of hard riding. Call the council. Everyone who's left. We have work to do. The council chamber was half empty. 2 members dead from Thalia's coup. 3 more fled when news of Riker's capture spread. That left 5 sitting at the stone table, looking at him with expressions ranging from relief to wariness. Riker didn't sit on his throne. Instead, he stood at the table like an equal. His voice was firm, but not domineering. The Empire is fracturing. That's my fault for building it too dependent on single leader authority. We're going to fix that starting now. Garrett has designed systems for distributed governance, regional councils with real power, succession protocols that don't require combat dominance. We implement them immediately. Councilman Drake spoke carefully. With respect, this sounds like what got Garrett accused of treason. The difference is he was doing it behind my back to undermine my authority. Now I'm ordering it openly to strengthen the Empire's foundation. Riker looked around the table. I'm not abdicating, but I am delegating. Each region gets autonomy within agreed parameters. The Council gets actual legislative authority instead of just advisory role. We build something that survives beyond me. And Marcus Thorne? Drake asked. We negotiate. Give him legitimate authority over the Northern Territories in exchange for remaining part of the Empire's defensive network. Make him a partner instead of a rebel. He seized those lands by force, and I seized this entire empire by force. Riker's voice hardened slightly. We can spend the next decade crushing every challenge to centralized authority, or we can adapt to reality and build something more resilient. I choose adaptation. The debate raged for hours. Some council members supported the changes. Others worried they were surrendering too much power. But Riker pushed forward with a combination of his old dominance and his new willingness to actually listen to objections. By dawn, they had a framework, rough and incomplete but workable. A path forward that didn't require Riker being everywhere at once, controlling everything. Garrett found him afterward, standing on the battlements watching the sun rise over his empire. You did good in there. We'll see. Riker didn't turn. Half of them think I've gone soft, the other half think I'm setting a trap. Are you? No. I'm just tired of the cost of absolute authority, tired of having to be perfect, because one mistake means everything collapses. Welcome to actual leadership instead of tyranny. Garrett leaned against the wall. For what it's worth, I think this might work. And if it doesn't, then we adjust. That's what growth looks like. Trying things, failing, adapting. They stood in comfortable silence watching the compound wake up, people moving about their business, the empire continuing despite the chaos of recent weeks, something resilient taking shape even in the midst of transformation. Then a messenger arrived, mud-splattered and exhausted. He brought news that shattered the fragile peace. Marcus Thorne wasn't negotiating. He'd formed an alliance with the Southern Alliance, pooling resources for a coordinated assault on Riker's compound. They were mobilizing now. 3 armies converging from different directions, overwhelming force designed to crush the Alpha King once and for all. The messenger's voice shook as he delivered the details. They'll be here in 4 days, maybe 10,000 strong. Sir, we have 3,000 warriors at most, and half are scattered across territories trying to hold what's left. Riker listened without expression, then asked the only question that mattered. Can we evacuate the civilians? Not all of them, not in time, not in... Then we don't evacuate, we defend. Riker turned to Garrett. Call in everyone, every warrior, every able-bodied person who can hold a weapon. We make our stand here. This is suicide, Garrett said quietly. Even if we fight perfectly, the numbers are against us. Probably. But running just means they chase us forever, picking us apart piece by piece. Better to end it here. All of it. He looked out over his empire. Either we hold or this whole experiment burns down. Either way, we'll know. Here's the thing about facing overwhelming odds with no escape route and everything you've built on the line. It clarifies things, strips away all the political calculation and strategic flexibility and leaves just the fundamental question, what are you willing to die for? Riker had built an empire on power and violence, and the principle that strength was the only currency that mattered. He'd nearly destroyed it through obsession. He'd tried to walk away from it through principle. Now he was back, leading it toward either transformation or annihilation. And he was finally, completely at peace with both possibilities. Over the next 4 days, the compound became a fortress. Every able-bodied person worked on fortifications. Warriors drilled in tactics designed for defending against superior numbers. Civilians who couldn't fight prepared supplies and medical stations. Alara worked alongside the healers, organizing medicine and preparing for casualties that would likely overwhelm their capacity. She and Riker barely spoke, both focused on their respective preparations. But sometimes their eyes would meet across the courtyard, and something passed between them. Not love exactly, but understanding. Acceptance of what was coming. Garrett coordinated the military response with brutal efficiency. He positioned archers on the walls, set traps in the approaches, prepared fallback positions for when, not if, the outer defenses fell. On the third night, Riker called his warriors together in the Great Hall. They crowded in, hundreds of scarred veterans and young recruits barely old enough to grow beards, all looking at him with the mixture of fear and determination that had defined his empire from the beginning. "You know what's coming," Riker began without preamble. 3 armies, 10,000 strong, led by people who want to prove the Alpha King is just a man who bleeds like anyone else. His voice carried to the back of the hall. "They're right. I am just a man. But I'm a man who built something worth defending. Not an empire of fear, but a system that gives people stability and purpose and something to believe in." He moved through the crowd, meeting eyes. "Some of you have followed me for years. Some joined yesterday. Doesn't matter. You're here because you chose to stand when you could have run. Because you believe this compound, this empire, this idea of order from chaos is worth the cost." A young warrior near the front spoke up, voice shaking. "Sir, are we going to win?" Riker stopped, looked at him directly. "Honestly? Probably not. The numbers are against us. The odds are terrible. We're likely all going to die in the next few days." The hall went silent. "But here's what I know," Riker continued. "Dying defending something you built is better than living as someone else's prisoner. Fighting for your people is better than running to save yourself. And making a last stand that means something is better than surrendering to inevitability." He raised his voice. "So no, we probably won't win. But we'll make them bleed for every inch. We'll show them what it costs to challenge people who refuse to break. And if we die knowing we fought for something real." The hall erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper. The sound of people accepting their fate and choosing defiance anyway. The sound of an empire deciding that if it was going to fall, it would fall fighting. Riker met Garrett's eyes across the crowd. His old friend nodded once, understanding passing between them. This was it. The culmination of everything they'd built and fought for. Win or lose, this was how their story ended. That night, Riker couldn't sleep. He walked the battlements, checking fortifications, talking to guards, trying to memorize every face because so many of them wouldn't survive what was coming. Alara found him just before dawn. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him watching the horizon lighten. Finally, she spoke. "You don't have to do this. You could still run. Save yourself. And abandon everyone who stayed because they believed in me?" Riker shook his head. "I've made a lot of mistakes. Let people down in ways I can't fix. But I won't do that. Not this time. Even if it means dying, especially if it means dying, because that's the difference between the tyrant I was and the leader I'm trying to become." He turned to look at her. "A tyrant runs when the cost gets too high. A real leader stands with their people even when it's suicide." Alara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I wish I'd met you like this, instead of the man who put me in a tower and called it love." "Me too." They stood in silence as the sun broke over the mountains, and in the distance, faintly but growing louder, came the sound of armies approaching. Drums and marching feet and the clash of weapons. The sound of inevitable violence coming to claim everything Riker had built. He drew his sword, feeling its familiar weight. Behind him, the compound stirred. Warriors taking positions. Civilians retreating to inner chambers. Everyone preparing for what came next. Garrett appeared at his side, fully armored, carrying the battle standard of their empire. "You ready?" "No, but it's happening anyway." They took their positions on the main wall, 3,000 defenders facing the approaching tide of 10,000 enemies. The math was simple and brutal. Even fighting perfectly, they were going to lose. But perfect fights were for history books. Reality was messy and bloody and unpredictable. The armies appeared on the horizon, 3 columns converging exactly as the intelligence had warned. Marcus Thorne's northern forces to the left, Southern Alliance troops to the right, a mixed force of opportunistic rebels in the center, all marching toward the compound with the inexorable momentum of history itself. Riker raised his sword, and his people roared. Not a cheer, but a war cry. The sound of defiance in the face of annihilation. The sound of people who'd decided that how they died mattered more than whether they survived. The approaching armies stopped just outside weapon range. A single rider came forward under a white flag. Riker recognized the warrior as one of Marcus Thorne's lieutenants. The man's voice carried across the distance. Marcus Thorne offers terms. Surrender the Alpha King for execution. The rest of you live. Fight, and everyone dies. Riker stepped to the wall's edge, making himself visible. Tell Marcus I have counterterms. Turn around and go home. Leave this empire alone, or learn why I built it in the first place. The messenger's face hardened. You're outnumbered 3-1. I've had worse odds. The messenger turned and rode back. Moments later, the three armies advanced, slowly at first, then picking up speed. A wave of steel and violence rolling toward the compound with the force of inevitability itself. Riker looked at his people one last time, saw fear in their faces but also determination, saw the recognition that this was their moment, their choice, their stand. He thought of Ilara, safe in the inner chambers, thought of the empire he'd built and was about to lose, thought of the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become. Then he raised his sword and screamed the only word that mattered. Now! The compound erupted, arrows darkening the sky, catapults launching stones and burning pitch. The first wave of attackers hitting walls turned into killing zones, blood and screams and the terrible chaos of battle consuming everything. And in the center of it all, Riker Vance fought like the Alpha King he'd always been, leading his people in a last stand that would either save his empire or become its funeral pyre. The outcome hung in the balance as steel met flesh, and the compound walls ran red with the cost of defiance. The first wave broke against the compound walls like water against stone. Arrows and catapult stones tore through advancing troops, turning the ground before the gates into a charnel house of screaming men and spilled blood. But they kept coming. 10,000 strong meant they could afford losses that would break smaller forces. Riker fought on the main wall, his sword rising and falling in a rhythm as old as warfare itself. Cut, block, thrust, move to the next target. His arms burned with exhaustion, but muscle memory carried him through, decades of combat experience making every motion efficient and deadly. Beside him, Garrett commanded the archers with brutal precision, targeting officers, breaking formations before they could organize. His voice cut through the chaos, directing defenders to weak points in their own line, redistributing forces as sections of wall came under heavy assault. The battle raged for 3 hours before the first breach opened. A section of eastern wall collapsed under concentrated battering ram strikes, and enemy troops poured through the gap like floodwater finding a crack in a dam. Riker was there in moments, leading a countercharge that met the invaders in the breach itself. The fighting turned vicious, too close for arrows or strategy, just steel and fury and men dying in the narrow space where wall met courtyard. He killed a man wearing Marcus Thorne's colors, then another bearing the Southern Alliance crest. His armor ran red with blood that might have been his, or might have been from the dozen wounds he'd inflicted. Time became elastic, seconds stretching into eternities of violence, minutes compressing into flashes of awareness between strikes. They held the breach. Barely. Bodies piled so high they became an obstacle that slowed the next wave of attackers. But Riker knew it was temporary. The numbers were inexorable. For every enemy they killed, 2 more pushed forward. For every defender who fell, there was no replacement. The mathematics of annihilation were simple and inevitable. By the 4th hour, they'd lost a third of their warriors. The walls were holding, but barely. Fires burned in 3 sections of the compound from flaming projectiles that had found targets. The air tasted like smoke and copper, and the particular stench of battlefield death that coated the throat and never quite washed away. Riker found a moment to breathe, leaning against blood-slick stone. His entire body screamed protest. He'd taken wounds he didn't remember receiving, a slash across his ribs that made breathing agony, something wrong with his left shoulder that sent lightning through his arm with every movement, blood running down his face from a cut on his scalp that had mostly stopped bleeding but left his vision hazy on one side. This is what the end looks like, he thought. Not dramatic or heroic, just exhaustion and pain and the slow, grinding certainty that you can't hold much longer. Garrett appeared beside him, looking equally ravaged. We need to fall back to the inner compound. The walls won't hold another hour. How many have we lost? 1,500, maybe more. Garrett's voice was flat with exhaustion and grief. They're breaking us apart, Riker. Doesn't matter how well we fight. The numbers are too much. Then we make them pay for every inch. They already are. But it won't matter if we're all dead. Riker looked at his second-in-command, at the man who'd betrayed him and then risked everything to save him, at the closest thing he had to family in a life built on violence and solitude. What would you do? If you were leading this fight, Garrett was quiet for a long moment, then said something that cost him visible effort. I'd order you to escape. Take Alara and a small group, break through the weakest section of the siege and run. Let the compound fall but preserve the possibility of rebuilding. And the people who stay? They die buying you time. It's brutal calculus, but it's the only path that doesn't end with complete annihilation. Here's what leadership actually means when everything is falling apart and all your choices are terrible. It means accepting that you can't save everyone, that sometimes the best you can do is choose which tragedy you can live with, that the weight of command isn't about making good decisions, but about making necessary ones and carrying the cost. Riker had spent his entire life making hard choices, sacrificing some to save others, breaking individuals to preserve the collective. That was how empires were built and maintained, through ruthless prioritization and the willingness to do violence in service of stability. But something had changed in him during those days in the Southern Alliance cell. Some fundamental recognition that he was tired of being the man who calculated human worth in terms of strategic value, tired of the endless trade-offs that left him standing on mountains of corpses while telling himself it was necessary. No, he said quietly. Garrett stared at him. Can't be serious. I'm not running. I'm not abandoning these people to die while I escape to rebuild. That's the old pattern. The cycle that never ends. Someone always has to be sacrificed so the Alpha King can survive. Then we all die here. Today. For nothing. Not for nothing. For the principle that a leader doesn't ask people to die for him unless he's willing to die with them. Riker straightened despite the pain. That's the difference I've been trying to find, between tyranny and actual leadership. A tyrant preserves himself at any cost. A leader stands with his people even when it's suicide. That's not wisdom. That's martyrdom. Maybe they're the same thing. Maybe the only way to truly transform is to be willing to let the old version die completely. Before Garrett could respond, a new sound cut through the battlefield noise. Horns, not from the attacking armies, but from somewhere beyond them. A different cadence, a signal Riker didn't recognize. Both men looked toward the source and saw something impossible. A fourth army was approaching, smaller than the others, maybe 2,000 strong, but moving with purpose and discipline. They hit the rear of Marcus Thorne's northern forces like a hammer, catching them completely by surprise. The banner they carried made Riker's chest constrict. It was his own crest, the wolf and mountain design of his empire. But the forces weren't ones he recognized. Kira appeared on the wall, pointing. Sir, those are regional militias, from territories we thought had declared independence. They're attacking the siege forces. Why? Garrett demanded. Why would they come back now? Riker understood even before the answer came. Because distributed governance meant those regions had real authority now, had been given autonomy and respect instead of just being absorbed territories forced to obey. And when the Empire's core was threatened, they'd chosen to defend it not out of fear but out of actual loyalty. The calculus of the battle shifted, not enough to guarantee victory, but enough to make it possible. The attacking armies found themselves caught between the compound's defenders and unexpected reinforcements. Coordination broke down. Units started withdrawing to regroup. Riker seized the moment. He raised his sword and roared orders. Push forward. Every warrior who can stand. We break them now while they're confused. The compound gates opened. Riker led the countercharge personally, 3,000 exhausted defenders becoming an avalanche of rage and desperation. They hit the disorganized attackers with everything left, and suddenly the ones who'd been so confident in their numerical superiority were fighting on two fronts against enemies who refused to break. The battle turned into chaos. Units scattering, command structures collapsing. What had been an organized siege became a confused melee where advantage swung moment to moment. Riker found himself facing Marcus Thorne personally. The rebel general sat his horse in the middle of the carnage, trying to rally his troops. Their eyes met across 30 yards of blood-soaked ground. Marcus dismounted, drew his sword, walked forward with the inevitability of fate itself. Riker met him halfway. No words. Just two men who'd built their identities on strength and dominance, settling everything through the oldest language humans knew. They fought like legends. Marcus was younger, faster, less damaged by the day's battle, but Riker had decades of experience and the desperate fury of a man defending everything he'd built. Steel rang against steel, both men bleeding from a dozen wounds, neither giving ground. The battle raged around them but seemed to pause in their immediate vicinity. Warriors from both sides watching their leaders settle this the way it had always been settled, through personal combat and the recognition that some conflicts could only be resolved through violence. Marcus scored a deep cut across Riker's chest. Riker responded by breaking the younger man's knee with a brutal kick. They went to the ground, grappling in mud turned to paste by blood and rain that had started falling. "This could have been different," Marcus gasped. "Could have been peaceful transition instead of this." "Could have," Riker agreed. "But you chose alliance with my enemies over negotiation, because you built an empire that only works with you at the top. I was trying to create something better. By destroying what exists first, that's not vision. That's just another tyrant claiming righteousness." They rolled, each trying for advantage. Riker's blade found Marcus's side. Not fatal, but deep enough to change the equation. The younger man's strength started fading, blood loss and pain taking their toll. "Yield," Riker said. "Never. Then die." But Riker didn't strike the killing blow. Instead, he pulled back slightly, held his blade at Marcus's throat, but didn't push. Because something had shifted in him during this entire catastrophic sequence. Some recognition that killing this man would just continue the cycle, would prove that strength was the only currency, would make the Empire's transformation meaningless. "You're right," Riker said. "The Empire only works with me at the top. That's the flaw I've been trying to fix." He pressed the blade just enough to draw a thin line of blood. "So here's what happens. You yield. You accept authority of the regional councils we're building. You get legitimate governance of the Northern Territories in exchange for remaining part of the defensive network. You become part of the solution instead of dying as part of the problem." Marcus's eyes widened. "You're offering me terms? After this? I'm offering you the choice I didn't give people before. Bend the knee to a system instead of to me personally. Help build something that outlasts both of us." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of killing everyone who challenges me. Tired of the Empire being held together by fear instead of actual cooperation." Riker pulled the blade back. "This ends one way or another today. Either we all die fighting over scraps of my legacy, or we evolve into something that doesn't require a monster at the helm." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, blood running from wounds, pride warring with pragmatism. The weight of all his warriors watching this moment and waiting to see what their leader chose. Then slowly, painfully, Marcus Thorne knelt. His voice carried across the battlefield. "I yield, not to the Alpha King, but to the Empire's future." The fighting didn't stop immediately, but it faltered. Warriors on both sides watching their leaders negotiate peace from the middle of carnage, watching the impossible happen. Riker raised his voice so everyone could hear. "The siege is over. Any who wish to continue fighting can face me personally. Any who want to survive and help build something better, lay down your weapons." The Southern Alliance forces hesitated. They'd come for conquest and revenge. But their primary ally had just surrendered, and the compound's reinforcements were cutting through their flanks with brutal efficiency. One by one, weapons clattered to the ground. Not surrender exactly, but acknowledgement that continuing meant certain death for uncertain gain. By nightfall, it was over. Not victory in any clean sense. The compound was half destroyed. Bodies littered every surface. Fully half of Riker's original defenders were dead or dying. The cost had been catastrophic, but they'd held. The Empire had survived. Riker walked through the carnage as healers worked and the dead were gathered for burning. His body was a map of pain, every step agony, but he forced himself to see the cost, to look at the faces of those who'd died defending what he'd built. He found Alara in the medical chambers, working alongside other healers despite having no formal training. Her hands were bloody to the elbows, her face streaked with smoke and exhaustion. She looked up when he entered, and something complicated passed across her expression. "You're alive," she said. "Barely." She gestured him to a bench. "Sit. Let me look at your wounds. There are people more injured. Sit anyway." Riker sat, let her cut away armor and clothing to expose the damage underneath. Her hands were gentle but professional as she cleaned and stitched, working in silence that felt heavier than words. Finally she spoke. "You could have run. Garrett told me the plan." "I know. But you stayed. Someone had to." Riker watched her work, feeling the pull of thread through flesh. "And I was tired of being the man who survives by abandoning everyone else." Alara finished one wound and moved to the next. Her voice was soft. "I heard what you offered Marcus Thorne. Peace instead of execution. Seemed worth trying. The Alpha King I met months ago would have killed him for the challenge alone. That Alpha King died in a Southern Alliance cell. This is someone else. Still figuring out who." She finished the last stitch and sat back, studying him with those dark eyes that had seen through his armor from the beginning. And who is he? This new person? Riker considered the question honestly. A man trying to be worthy of the second chance he doesn't deserve. Trying to build something that doesn't require constant violence to maintain. Trying to prove that change is possible even when you've spent decades being one thing. Is it working? Ask me in a year, if we survive that long. Alara almost smiled. Then her expression grew serious. "I meant what I said before. When this is done, I'm leaving." "I know. You're really going to let me walk away?" Riker met her eyes. "Yes. Because keeping you was never about you. It was about me trying to control something pure in a world I'd made ugly through violence. You deserve better than being someone's proof of humanity. What will you do without your obsession? Learn to live without one. Learn to lead without needing to possess. Learn to be alone without turning that loneliness into justification for taking what doesn't want to be taken." Alara reached out and touched his face gently. The gesture was almost unbearably tender coming from someone he'd hurt so badly. "For what it's worth, I think you might actually make it. This new version of you. And if I don't, then at least you tried. That's more than most people manage." She stood and returned to treating other wounded. Riker sat there, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. The Empire saved but damaged. His people victorious but devastated. His own transformation incomplete but genuine. The next weeks were brutal work. Rebuilding walls, burying dead, negotiating with regional governors to formalize the distributed governance structure. Every day brought new challenges and complications. Marcus Thorne proved surprisingly valuable once he committed to the new system. His understanding of Northern territories and his credibility with former rebels helped smooth transitions that might otherwise have sparked more conflict. The man was still ambitious, still driven, but now channeling that energy into building rather than destroying. Garrett worked himself near to death implementing the reforms, creating councils with real authority, establishing oversight mechanisms, training regional administrators. The man who'd betrayed Riker to build the system now gave everything to make it work. Late one night, Riker found him in the council chambers, surrounded by documents and looking a decade older than he had months before. "You should sleep," Riker said. "Can't. Too much to do." Garrett didn't look up from the ledger he was reviewing. "If we don't get these trade agreements finalized, 3 regions will be at each other's throats by spring. They'll still be there in the morning." Garrett finally looked up, exhaustion clear in every line of his face. "Why do you trust me with this? After everything I did?" Riker moved to the window, looking out over a compound slowly healing from battle damage. "Because you were right. About everything. The Empire was too dependent on me. The system was fragile. Change was necessary. You just went about it the wrong way. I betrayed you." "Yes. And I've spent the months since trying to figure out if that can be forgiven or if we're just pretending because we need each other. And I don't know yet. Maybe forgiveness isn't something you achieve. Maybe it's something you practice, every day choosing to trust again despite the wound." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry. For what it's worth. I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing, but I'm sorry for the cost." Apology noted. Riker turned to face him. Now finish the work. Make this system worth what it costs to build. 2 months after the siege, Alara came to Riker's chambers. She was packed for travel, wearing practical clothes instead of the healer's robes she'd adopted during recovery efforts. "I'm leaving today," she said without preamble. Riker had known this was coming, but it still felt like a wound opening fresh. "Where will you go?" "West. Maybe the coastal settlements. Somewhere I can just be a person instead of the woman who broke the Alpha King." "You didn't break me. You showed me I was already broken. There's a difference." Alara moved closer. "This is the part where you're supposed to ask me to stay." "I know, but I'm not going to, because you deserve the freedom to choose your own life without my wants complicating it. What if I wanted you to ask? Then you tell me instead of waiting for me to pressure you." Riker smiled sadly. "I'm learning the difference between love and possession. Learning that caring about someone means wanting what's best for them even when that doesn't include you." She studied his face for a long moment. "You really have changed." "I'm trying. Some days I succeed. Some days I still want to lock you in that tower and pretend I have the right. But you won't." "No, I won't." Alara stepped forward and kissed him. Not passionate or romantic, just a gentle acknowledgement of what might have been if they'd met in different circumstances. If he'd been the man he was becoming instead of the monster he'd been. When she pulled back, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Goodbye, Riker. Build something good. Be someone worthy of the empire you're creating. I'll try. That's all anyone can do." She walked out without looking back. Riker stood at the window and watched her ride through the compound gates toward a horizon that didn't include him, and felt something release in his chest. Not relief exactly, but acceptance. The recognition that letting go was harder and more necessary than holding on. Here's what redemption actually looks like when you've spent decades being someone terrible. It's not a dramatic transformation or a single moment of clarity. It's the daily choice to be better than your worst instincts. It's living with the consequences of your past while working toward a different future. It's accepting that some wounds you caused will never fully heal, but trying anyway to stop creating new ones. Riker would never be free of what he'd been, the bodies he'd stacked, the cruelty he'd justified, the woman he'd hurt through obsessive possession. Those things were permanent marks on his soul that no amount of growth would erase. But he could choose to be something other than their sum, could build systems that didn't require tyranny, could develop relationships based on respect instead of dominance, could become someone who made different choices even when the old patterns would be easier. 6 months after the siege, the Empire held its first regional council assembly. Governors from all territories gathering not to receive orders but to participate in governance, to debate policy and establish laws and hold each other accountable. Riker attended but didn't lead. He sat at the table as one voice among many, offered perspective when asked, deferred to expertise when others knew better, watched as the empire he'd built through force slowly transformed into something held together by cooperation. It was messy, inefficient, frustrating in ways that absolute authority never was. Decisions took longer. Compromises diluted clear vision. The whole process was maddeningly human in its complexity and imperfection. But it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The empire was becoming something that could survive beyond him. Something built on systems instead of a single strong man holding everything together through violence. Garrett found him after one particularly contentious session. "You're getting better at this. Letting others lead." "Years of therapy ahead of me still," Riker said. "Every time they make a decision I disagree with, I want to just override them. Make it happen through force like I always did. But you don't." "No. I practice sitting with discomfort instead. Trusting that collective wisdom might actually exceed my individual judgment. That's growth. That's exhausting." They shared a laugh, the first genuinely comfortable moment between them in months. The wound of betrayal was healing slowly. Maybe it would never fully close, but they were learning to work together despite it, and that counted for something. A year after the siege, reports came that Alara had settled in a coastal village. She was working as a healer, had apparently formed connections with the community. The messenger who brought the news mentioned she seemed content. Riker absorbed the information without asking for more details, without sending people to check on her or ensure her safety. Just accepted that she was living her life and he had no role in it. Garrett noticed his restraint. That couldn't have been easy. hearing about her and not inserting yourself. It gets easier every time I choose not to. Riker looked at the map of their empire, now marked with regional council jurisdictions instead of military districts. The hard part is living with the fact that she's happier without me than she ever was when I tried to keep her close. That says more about possession than about you specifically. Probably. But it's still my lesson to learn. The empire continued evolving. Not perfectly. There were setbacks and conflicts. Some regional governors tried to consolidate too much power. Others proved incompetent and had to be replaced. The system required constant adjustment and attention. But it endured. And more importantly, it improved. Trade increased between regions that used to compete. Coordinated defense made borders more secure. People who'd lived under constant threat of violence started experiencing something approaching peace. Riker's role diminished as the system strengthened. He was still respected, still consulted on major decisions. But he was no longer essential. The Empire could function without him, which had always been the goal but still felt strange to experience. Late one evening, standing on the battlements where he'd watched so much blood spill, Riker considered what he'd become. Not the Alpha King anymore. Not the tyrant who ruled through fear and force. Just a man who'd tried to change and sometimes succeeded. The scars on his body had mostly healed. The wounds to his soul remained works in progress. He thought about Alara often, but didn't reach out. Missed the empire he'd built, but knew the new version was better. Carried the weight of thousands of deaths he'd caused, but tried to build something that prevented more. Here's the truth about transformation when you've been a monster. You don't get to become a hero. The best you can hope for is to become someone who does less harm. Someone who builds instead of just destroys. Someone who recognizes their own capacity for evil and chooses differently anyway. Riker would never be redeemed, would never earn forgiveness for all he'd done. The throne room where he'd made brutal judgments would always echo with screams of those he'd sentenced. The tower where he'd imprisoned Alara would always stand as testament to his capacity for obsessive cruelty. But he could choose to be better than his worst moments, could work to create systems that prevented future tyrants, could live with the uncomfortable truth that he was both the man who'd built an empire through violence and the man trying to transform it into something that didn't require constant bloodshed. 2 years after the siege, a new crisis emerged. A neighboring territory threatened invasion, seeing the empire's distributed governance as weakness. The regional councils debated response for days, unable to reach consensus. Finally, they called Riker to the chamber. The old warrior stood before the assembled governors, feeling the weight of their expectations. They wanted him to be the Alpha King again, to make the hard decision through executive authority, to solve the problem through force. Instead, he said something that cost him effort. I trust your judgment. Whatever you decide, I'll support. But this is your empire now, your responsibility, your choice. The councils wrestled with the decision for 3 more days. Eventually reached a compromise that combined diplomatic pressure with military preparation. It wasn't what Riker would have chosen. It was slower and more complicated. But it worked. The neighboring territory backed down without violence. The empire held together through cooperation instead of dominance. And Riker felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Pride in something other than his own strength. Pride in a system that functioned without requiring his personal intervention. Garrett found him afterward. You could have made that decision in minutes. I know. But then it would have been my empire again, my choice, my authority superseding everyone else's. Riker smiled slightly. This way it's theirs. They own the decision and the outcome. And if they'd chosen wrong, then they'd learn from the consequences. Same as I had to learn from mine. On the 3rd anniversary of the siege, the compound held a memorial ceremony. Every name carved into stone, every face remembered, the cost of transformation made permanent and visible. Riker stood before the wall of names and felt the weight of responsibility. These people had died defending what he'd built, some believing in him personally, others believing in the idea of order and stability, all gone because of choices that rippled from his actions. He traced fingers over names, warriors he'd known for years, young recruits who'd barely started their lives, civilians caught in violence they'd never asked for, the mathematics of empire written in granite and grief. A young woman approached him. She couldn't have been more than 20, with her father's eyes and her mother's determined expression. Sir, she said quietly, I'm Kira's daughter. Riker turned, remembering his head of security, who'd been killed in the first wave of the siege. Your mother was exceptional, brave and loyal, and everything this empire needed. I know. The young woman touched the wall where her mother's name was carved. I'm joining the regional guard, following her path. She'd be proud. Would she? The daughter's eyes met his. Would she be proud that I'm serving an empire built on violence? Or would she want me to do something else? Riker considered the question honestly. Your mother believed in protecting people. That's what she dedicated her life to. Whether you do that through military service or healing or building or any other path, you're honoring her if you're making the world safer for someone. The young woman nodded slowly. Thank you. She walked away, and Riker stood alone with the dead. All the names of all the people who'd paid the cost of his journey from tyrant to something approaching human. They'd bought his transformation with their blood, and he owed them the responsibility of making it mean something. 4 years after the siege, Riker received word that Marcus Thorne had proposed a unified military command structure that would coordinate defense across all regions while maintaining local autonomy. The councils were debating it. Riker reviewed the proposal and recognized Marcus's strategic brilliance. It solved the primary weakness of distributed governance, vulnerability to external threats, while preserving the autonomy that made the system sustainable. He sent his endorsement to the councils without inserting himself into the debate. Just his opinion offered as one perspective among many. The councils approved it 3 weeks later. Marcus Thorne became the first Supreme Commander of the Unified Defense Forces, reporting to the councils rather than to any single leader. It was everything Riker had tried to build through force, created instead through cooperation and shared purpose. 5 years after the siege, reports filtered back that Alara had married, a merchant from her coastal settlement. They were building a life together. She'd mentioned Riker to someone who mentioned it to someone else until the information reached him third hand and stripped of detail. Riker absorbed the news alone in his chambers, felt the complicated mix of happiness for her and grief for what he'd lost and acceptance that this was right. She deserved joy that had nothing to do with him, deserved to build relationships based on choice instead of captivity. He didn't send congratulations, didn't insert himself into her life even in that small way, just let her go completely, and finally, released the last threads of possession and obsession that had driven him to such destructive places. Here's what freedom from obsession actually feels like. Not relief or closure or any clean emotion, just the slow recognition that you can think about someone without needing to act on it, can care about their well-being without requiring involvement in their life, can accept that some chapters close without dramatic endings or mutual understanding. Riker had loved Alara in the only way he'd known how, through possession and control and the arrogant belief that he knew what was best for her. That love had been toxic and destructive and had nearly cost both of them everything. Now he loved her differently, by leaving her alone, by wanting her happiness even when it didn't include him, by recognizing that the most loving thing he could do was stay far away from her life. It wasn't romantic, wasn't the kind of love celebrated in stories, but it was real and hard-won and spoke to actual growth. 7 years after the siege, Riker stood at the same window where he'd once watched Alara leave. The compound looked different, rebuilt with architecture that emphasized community gathering spaces instead of just defensibility. The walls still stood, but gardens grew inside them now. Children played in courtyards that had once run red with blood. The empire had transformed. 15 regional councils governed with real authority. Trade flourished. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation more often than violence. The system Garrett had envisioned and nearly betrayed him to build was functioning better than Riker's absolute rule ever had. And Riker himself had become something he never expected. An elder statesman. Someone consulted for wisdom rather than command. A living reminder of what the Empire had been and what it had chosen to become instead. Garrett found him there, both men older now, gray threading through hair that had once been dark, scars that ached in cold weather. The accumulated weight of years lived violently and the toll of transformation. Thinking about the old days, Garrett asked. Thinking about how far we've come. How much it cost. Whether it was worth it. Was it? Riker considered the question honestly. Ask me on my deathbed. When I can see the full picture of what we built and whether it outlasts us. Fair enough. Garrett leaned against the wall. For what it's worth, I think it will. This system is stronger than anything held together by fear. Because you designed it that way. We designed it, even when you were resisting every step. They stood in comfortable silence. The friendship between them had evolved into something more honest than before, built on acknowledged wounds and chosen trust instead of just shared history. I forgive you, Riker said quietly, for the betrayal, for the conspiracy. All of it. Garrett looked at him sharply. After all this time, took me 7 years to mean it, to genuinely let go of the wound instead of just pretending I had. He met his old friend's eyes. But I'm there now. You were trying to build something better, and you succeeded even if your methods were questionable. That counts for something. Garrett's voice was rough. Thank you. That means more than you know. Don't waste it. Keep building. Keep making this system work. Make my transformation mean something by proving it can outlast me. I will. 10 years after the siege, on a morning that dawned clear and cold, Riker Vance died peacefully in his sleep. Not in battle, not assassinated by enemies, just worn out by decades of violence and the exhausting work of trying to become better than his worst instincts. They found him in his chambers, looking more at peace than anyone had seen him in life. The funeral was attended by thousands. Regional governors and former enemies, warriors he'd led and civilians he'd protected, all gathering to mark the passing of someone who'd been both monster and man. Garrett delivered the eulogy. He spoke honestly about Riker's brutality and his transformation, about the empire built on violence and the man who'd tried to evolve it into something better, about the cost of change and the courage required to admit you were wrong about everything. Marcus Thorne stood in the crowd, bearing the rank of Supreme Commander that Riker's distributed governance had made possible. Beside him stood governors of regions that had once been conquered territories, now autonomous partners in a functional coalition. And somewhere far to the west, in a coastal settlement where waves crashed against ancient stone, Elara received word of his death. She stood alone on a cliff watching the ocean and let herself feel the complicated grief of mourning someone who'd hurt her terribly and changed profoundly. She didn't return for the funeral. That chapter of her life was closed, and reopening it served no purpose. But she whispered words to the wind that might have been goodbye, or might have been acknowledgement that he'd finally done what she'd asked all those years ago. He'd let her go, really let her go, and in doing so had proven that change was possible even for monsters who thought they were beyond redemption. The empire Riker built outlasted him by generations, not through the force of his personality or the strength of his arm, but through the systems he'd painfully learned to create, through distributed governance and regional autonomy and the recognition that nothing built on one person's dominance can truly endure. His name became complicated in history. Not hero or villain, but something more honest. A man who'd done terrible things and then spent his later years trying to build something better. A tyrant who'd evolved into a leader. A monster who'd discovered his humanity too late to undo all the damage but par soon enough to change the trajectory. And in the end, that was his legacy. Not the empire he'd conquered, not the enemies he'd defeated, but the proof that transformation was possible. That you could spend decades being one thing and still choose to become something else. That growth was available even to those who seemed beyond redemption. The Alpha King was dead. But Riker Vance, the man who'd learned to be human again, had lived long enough to matter. And sometimes in a world built on violence and power, that small victory was enough.